I ask everyone this question. Could you introduce yourself and say what it is that you do?
All right. My name is Mark Maxwell-Smith. For many years, I had the good fortune of working in game shows. I haven't done a lot actively in the last few years, although I have two projects that are still percolating, one old and one new. And I spend most of my time now making visits to hospitals or camps for kids who have intense medical challenges, and I volunteer as a counselor and sometimes magician and all-around pain.
What are your earliest memories of film and television?
I was thinking about this the other day. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but when I was a little boy, we lived in New York City, and my parents had some kind of connection and were able to get tickets for the live dress rehearsal of what was then called the Sid Caesar Show. It was after the initial Your Show of Shows, and now it was, in fact, the reason I know it was not Your Show of Shows because it was no longer Imogen Coca. It was Nanette Fabray as the female performer lead, along with Howard Morris and Carl Reiner. And we sat up in the balcony of what must have been a converted Broadway theater, so it's early 1950s, and watched the dress rehearsal of the Sid Caesar Show. I was in single digits at that point, and I think that was one of the things that cemented my desire to be a part of the television industry one way or the other.
What kind of hobbies did you have growing up?
Oh, I don't think I had many hobbies. I was just an all-around silly kind of guy, and at some point when I was pretty young, my brother had been given and you probably have heard this from other people. My brother had been given a number of magic tricks by our uncle, and they were professional grade magic tricks. I think it was his hobby. And my brother got tired within about 30 seconds, I think, and he handed them to me. And I realized it was a great excuse to be able to stand in front of a group of people if I had the magic stuff to do. So I did do some kiddie magic, not even kiddie magic. I was the kid, and I was doing it for adults. And playing games. I think by the time I was 12 or 13, I was coming up with some game show ideas that were not really game shows because all I had was the dog as a contestant. So it wasn't much, but I remember recording some of them on my Webcore tape recorder, reel-to-reel Webcore tape recorder.
Where did you go to school?
It was all New York City. I was in the New York City public school system, PS 186, and the Hillside Junior High School, Francis Lewis High School, and then Queens College, which is part of the City University of New York. The big schooling was while I was in college. I also worked part-time at a radio station and learned, I think, a lot about the very first glimmers of what broadcasting is more through the radio station than through anything instructors taught me in school.
What was the name of that radio station?
It was WTFM. It was the International FM radio station. And it was in the days, all those years ago, when FM was the stepchild, and there was even an NAFMB, National Association of FM Broadcasters, and the format of this station was all of that wallpaper music, the soporific stuff you hear in the dentist's office or the elevators. And I was the record librarian and then became the music director of what was a one-person music department, and got to pull out the albums for the disc jockeys to play. And they weren't really disc jockeys in the sense that we think of, hey, top 40 hits. It was guys, each of whom had some sort of continental accent that was supposed to make the radio station seem as if it was on the high end of desirability.
And was this in New York or was this in?
This was New York along the Long Island Expressway in Fresh Meadows, Long Island, but it was really Queens, New York. Yeah.
What was your first break into television, or how did you break into television?
The break came through the radio station. There was a man at the radio station. His name was Gene Edwards. It was really Eugene Gugig, but he called himself Gene Edwards, and he was, like many guys who worked in radio, he was on air. He was also the program director, and then he realized he could make more money selling the commercial time. So he would sell time, and then he would also use his own voice to cut spots for the local advertisers. But Gene had a friend, I don't know how they ever met, but Gene had a friend who had moved out to California and suddenly hit pay dirt. And this friend was named Jerry Bender. That was the name that he gave himself. And Jerry was a promoter beyond my ability to describe. And he worked in the prize business in game shows, and we'll get into that in a minute. But Jerry had an idea, because it was 1969, ancient history for you, 1969, and the Apollo astronauts were getting ready to land on the moon. And Jerry had an idea, and he went to the Southland Corporation, the people who owned and maybe still own the 7-Eleven stores. And he said, here's this great idea, promotional record, 7-Eleven, America's lucky numbers, because it was Mercury 7 to Apollo 11. Here's 7-Eleven stores. This will be a promotional giveaway at your store. And they went for it. They bought his idea. Only it was an idea. And he, Bender, contacted my boss, Gene, and said, I need a documentary record album about the space program. And Gene got, I don't know how much money, but he enlisted my aid, and I did a lot of the research, and I guess I wrote some of the scripts as I remember it now. But it was Gene's voice, my research, and I ran the board. Because late at night, we snuck back into the radio station. Sneak is too strong a verb, but we were in there when the boss didn't know we were there. And we recorded this album. And Jerry Bender got the album and then made his money, whatever money he made, from the 7-Eleven Corporation. Less than a year later, when I realized that the only way I was going to make any headway was to drive out to California, the only connection that I had was this name, Jerry Bender, because he was a friend of my now soon-to-be ex-boss. I drove out to California, called up Jerry Bender. He was prepared because Gene Edwards told him I was going to contact him. And we had a meeting. And to make it very quick, at first he said he had nothing for me. And then a couple of days later, he called me and he offered me a job. Pretty much it was a gopher's job. And at first I turned him down. I thought, well, wait a minute. I'm here in California. Maybe I'm going to do something totally different. And I took a job at what I thought was a facility that would help young kids who were in trouble. It turned out it was a money-making scam because the guy who ran it just was getting money from the local counties to warehouse these kids who were not bad enough to go into juvenile detention, but not good enough to be out on their own. But there was really we were given a job, and it was called counselor, but I realized in desperation and despair that we were just there in name only, and we were not making any headway or any good in anybody's life. I called back Jerry Bender, and I mentioned his name a few times, and I'm telling you this part of the story because I am so grateful, because I called back and said, is the job still open? And he, of course, said, well, you turned me down once. How do I know you're going to? I said, believe me, I want the job. And he gave me the job, and I was, to use the French term, I was a schlepper. I was a gopher. I picked up props that needed to be on display at the show we were servicing. The show was a show called Truth or Consequences. And now, once a week for 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, because those were the tape days, I show up at the studio, and there is Bob Barker and some other names you won't know or maybe not know, but Ed Bailey and Charlie Lyon and Dresser Dahlstedt and all these people whom I had seen when I was a kid. I'm in the studio now, and I'm sure I got forms and a stopwatch, and I'm doing nothing more than signing people up for their prizes. But I'm here with the gods, the people I had seen on TV. And it was Gene Edwards asking me to help him with the project, Jerry Bender allowing me a second chance to get the job, and now here I was working for him, doing the prizes on Truth or Consequences. And the biggest part of that was a name that no one now will know, and his name was Dresser Dahlstedt. And Dresser Dahlstedt had been a staff announcer at ABC Radio Network. He was now working as an associate producer on Truth or Consequences, and after about 3 weeks on the job, maybe 4. And he was my go-to person. He was the guy who would call me up and say, Mark, in this act, we're going to have a husband and wife, and we need a major appliance. What do you have? And I'd look through the files. Or now we're going to have 3 college students. What kind of prize there? Whatever it is, my job was to interface with Dresser. And about 3 weeks in, Dresser called. And it wasn't his normal time to call, and I thought that was a little unusual. Now, I at this point, I was 22 years old. You can't tell it because I'm sitting down, and also I'm a lot older. But I was about 6'1", 6'2", and I weighed about 240 pounds. And I had a head full of hair, and Dresser Dahlstedt said, "You're a real neat guy, and I like you a lot, and here's what I think you may want to consider doing if you want to keep this job." Because what I didn't know was the people on Truth or Consequences had already called my boss and said, "This guy he's not our kind of guy." Because I was loud. I was New York. I knew everything there was to know. And Dresser, in a metaphorical sense, held my hand and led me toward the path of getting along with people who were, after all, responsible and could easily have told me to take a hike, and did me yet a third favor. Gene, Jerry Bender, and then Dresser Dahlstedt. And by the way, going all the way back to Gene, when I went to apply for the job at the radio station, he said, "Well, we really want a girl, but you're wearing a tie, so maybe. But don't, I see your major is broadcasting. Don't think that this job is any kind of a path opener for you. This is just, we need somebody to file records." And I went, "Okay, I'll still take it," at the low wage that it was offering. And that to me, I for years would go, WTFM led to Jerry Bender, led to Truth or Consequences, led to Ralph Edwards Productions, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. And those, I shouldn't say dominoes because that implies that they fall down, but those building blocks started that way. And I've always been fortunate that happened. And if somebody says to me, some college age person says, "Well, how do I get started in the business?" I never say, "Here's how you do it." I just say, "Here's what happened for me. And if you're fortunate, maybe it'll happen that way for you in a different way. But be prepared to work long hours for very little money."
What was your official title on Truth or Consequences?
Well, on Truth or Consequences, when I started, I wasn't even listed in the credits. I was an employee of PickTV. PickTV was listed on the credits as merchandising or prize acquisition or whatever it might have been. And then 2.5 or so years into it, I thought, oh my gosh, these ideas, I can come up with these ideas. And I wrote some ideas and I slipped them under the door of the head writer, a guy named Jerry Payne. I did not even put my name on it. And I waited until I knew he'd have a chance to read them. And then I asked him about it. And he went, "Yeah, these are some good." And they offered me, the first official was, I got hired to be an idea person. Then in those days, it would have said idea man. Okay. I got hired to be an idea man. And I was not officially a writer. And they were signatories of the Writers Guild agreement, but this was a special carve out they had. And I would just go to the meetings and pitch, how about this, or how about that, or how about this? And that lasted a short while till the end of that particular season. But the following year, there was a tragic event that led to some good fortune for me, which was that a very talented man named Bobby Lauer, Lauer, you can look him up. He was brilliant. He worked with Ernie Kovacs. And he and Milt Larson and Jerry Payne were 3 writers on the show. They'd been together for probably 15 or more years writing on the show. And Bobby Lauer, in his 40s, had a heart attack, and we lost him. And there was an opening on the show. And by then, I had met a guy named Marty Allen. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but Allen and Rossi. Marty Allen just passed last year, in fact. He lived a long time. And Marty Allen and his wife Frenchie came to Truth or Consequences one day. He was going to be a guest star on the show. And he didn't know who I was. And here I am in the green room, so they think this guy must be somebody. And I heard a voice say to Marty Allen, "So when can I tell you some jokes?" And then I realized that voice sounded familiar. And I realized further the voice was coming out of my mouth. And Marty, not knowing that I was just the prize guy, Marty and Frenchie must have just lost the guy that they had who was writing gags for them. And they grabbed me up, and while I was still doing prizes for Truth or Consequences, I started writing jokes for Marty Allen, which gave me cachet with the people at Truth or Consequences. Suddenly, he's writing jokes for Marty Allen. So that 6 months later, when Bobby passed, I was able to get a job as a staff writer. So this is the long answer to your short question. The first credit that I got on a television show was as a writer on Truth or Consequences. And as a result, I got to join the Writers Guild and was making, I don't remember what it was, but to me, suddenly a phenomenal amount of money, probably tripled or quadrupled what my salary had been at PickTV. And by the way, by then I had left PickTV because I didn't see a future there, and I had gone over to CBS. I'm trying to make this less complicated than it is, but I went from PickTV and Truth or Consequences over to CBS, where I met the Jack Barry people, including Richard Kline, whom we just lost last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I guess. And that gave me even more cachet, so that when Bobby left, and I have to give credit to Barker, because the show at first was going to offer me just an idea slot, and I held out for staff writer. Even by then I was 25, and I went, no, I'm married, I have responsibilities, I think I've proven my worth, and they gave me a job as a staff writer on Truth or Consequences. Okay, and I was so awestruck that for the first 6 months, now I'm an official employee of Ralph Edwards. I could never call him Ralph. First I called him Mr. Edwards, and he said, no, call me Ralph. Then I was calling him Uncle Ralph, because I still couldn't bring myself to call him. And eventually he dissuaded me, and I called him Ralph, and he called me Mark. That Truth or Consequences led to doing lots of stuff in a 6-year career with Ralph Edwards Productions.
What kind of stuff did you write for Truth or Consequences? Did you write questions? Did you write stunts? Did you write jokes? What did you write? It
actually started I wasn't there but 6 months or whatever, and was already woven into the fabric of the show. And you may remember, and from things that you've seen, that the premise was, if you didn't tell the truth, you had to pay the consequences. So they would ask you a question, and if you didn't answer it correctly, then you'd have to do whatever the bit was. Well, they didn't want you to answer it correctly, because the whole premise really was, to play some kind of joke on you, or to get you involved in whatever silly thing it was. So the questions that were asked were really riddles and puns, and that has been here's a fancy word, my métier since I'm a little boy. And one day I borrowed Nova Bay was the production assistant. I borrowed her typewriter, and I typed up a question. And the question was, what do you call young people growing up in Belgium? And I then handed it to Barker, who read it. And the answer, of course, was Brussels sprouts. All right. Barker laughed, and he said, I'm using that. Now, I didn't give it to him so I could make any money, because you weren't going to sell those. I just gave it to him. But the secret that I never told any of them was, I'd come up with that joke when I was in the 5th grade. I was 9 or 10 years old when it occurred to me that if Brussels is the capital of Belgium, or one of the capitals, that young people there are Brussels sprouts. I then learned a very valuable secret, that if you aim at people who are 10 or 11, you're going for a good market. So at first I was just coming up with those questions, but those questions were not the meat of the show. The meat of the show was that every week we needed 15 brand new acts. How do you fool people who are expecting to be fooled, and therefore are looking over their shoulder constantly? And somehow, and to this day, I don't know if it was my brain, being what it is, was just suited for that show, or if working on that show then made my brain do what it does, which is never stop. And that's great unless it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and then you don't want to have that kind of brain. But every week it was 15 new ideas. How are we going to get the wife to play a joke on the husband, or the husband to play a joke on the wife? And when I first started, I'd pitch an idea, and somebody would say, Detroit, 1951. And I go, what do you mean, Detroit, 1951? And they'd go, that's where and when we first did that idea or something like that idea. So it was very difficult to come up with new stuff because the show had been in existence longer than I had been in existence. The show was older than I was, if you count radio. And then there were times when we would do skits, and I was really good at this. So we would do a skit quite often if it were a reunion act, which is one of the things that was one of our standbys. You might write a little skit where you would assign roles to the contestants and make them play parts. And I was great at going home and writing those sketches with marvelous jokes. And one that I remember, to show you how television has changed, it was something about being in the park, and one of the contestants was going to be put in a tree costume, and then another contestant came out in a dog costume, and the tree was supposed to take a look at the dog and then take a giant step back or off to the side, as in, and the producer, a guy named Ed Bailey, went, "You can't do a pee joke. You can." Now, this is 1972 or 3, so times have changed, obviously, since then. So it was gags, it was the actual stunts, it was skits, and then Ralph recognized, or somebody recognized, that I had a comedic flair. Then, even in-house, if Ralph was called upon to do some kind of special appearance or an industrial show or something, they'd call me in and say, "Here's the script. Now can you punch it up? Can you write jokes? Can you write gags?" And to this day, I think if I had gotten somehow into sitcoms, which was a thought a long, long time ago, I think I would have been great at punching up. I would have been the gag guy. Not a story guy, but a gag guy.
From Truth or Consequences, did you immediately begin working on other shows from there, or did you first start doing warm-up after that? What was the path from there?
There were parallel lines. First of all, in what was an extremely generous situation for me, I told you earlier that I had left PickTV and therefore Truth or Consequences and gone over to CBS because they were starting a prize department. And I thought, well, now I'm a married guy. I'm a big old ancient man of 25. I'm married and I need to get a career. And I got a career at CBS as an executive doing the prizing. I'm backing up this, the story a couple of years. And I realized after about 4 weeks that I was not going to be happy sitting behind a desk. And every time I go down to the studio and just smell the studio, and literally just smell the studio, that was for me a joy. And one of the shows that I was supervising in terms of prizes was The Joker's Wild. I actually did 2. I did The Joker's Wild and Gambit because they had put all their efforts on The Price is Right because it was so heavily, such a heavy prize show. And after a few weeks at CBS, after having negotiated what for me was a great contract and everything, not a contract, but a deal, I realized that wasn't going to work. And my marvelous wife, my supportive wife, said, "Look, I'm working. We have no responsibilities. You're getting money from Marty Allen, writing the gags. It's time." And I would come home from CBS, and there was a picture on the door of the CBS sun setting. Like it was the CBS eye, but it was the sun setting in the distance, and the two of us waving goodbye. And my wife supported me, and I told CBS, "It's not working out. I'm leaving." And then I made sure that I told the Jack Barry people and the Heater Quigley people. Art Lisi was my go-to guy there, another guy we just lost. This is turning into an obituary here. And that night my phone rang, and it was Richard Kline. And Richard Kline, I'm thinking, why is he bothering me at home? It bothers me enough in the office. Why bother me at home? And Richard Kline said, "You seem to be a funny guy, and we're having trouble with the audience. And Johnny Jacobs is doing a good job, but it's just too much. Would you be willing to come for a few bucks and be a second banana to Johnny Jacobs? Not even do the actual warm-up, but sort of just be the cheerleader type." And I'm thinking, that's free money, and I'm going to get paid to do what I used to get yelled at in school for the same thing. So I said, sure. And I'm telling you this because, so now I'm at CBS at Joker, and I'm just doing the second banana kind of thing with the warm-up. It's not really the official warm-up, but I'm at times working with Johnny. And classic thing happened. the engineers went out on strike at CBS. And everything was fine with management aiming the cameras, and maybe every once in a while something was a little out of focus. But one day a camera broke, and all these guys who had ties on and did not have pocket protectors didn't know how to fix the camera, and we were down forever. And Johnny Jacobs had run out of everything, anything he had ever done, he did. And it got to a point where Jack Barry came out, and he was talking to the audience. And he said, I don't know what to do, because right now it's the engineers on strike, but in a few weeks, AFTRA is going to go on strike. And I'm a member of AFTRA, so I can't work, but I also own the show. So I'm the boss. So I don't know what we're going to do. And once again, just like the time the voice said to Marty Allen, can I tell you some jokes? I figured, why not? And I ran up on stage to the set that was, Jack and Johnny Jacobs were at the lip of the stage. It was the Price is Right stage. So they were higher up. They were out talking to the audience. And I ran back to the set and got behind Jack's lectern. And I said something like, welcome to Joker's Wild, and let's spin the wheels, and the categories are. And I ran back to the contestants, and I interviewed them, and I went back to Jack, and I went back and ran across. And Jack looked at me like I was the lunatic that I am. And he said, what are you doing? And I did my best Jerry Lewis, and I said, well, Mr. Barry, you said that, you may not be able to be here, and so I'm just getting ready. And he looked at me, and I could see, I know the look on his face, and I remember it, and it's now 50 years later. It will be, it's 48 years, okay? 48 years later, he took the mic, and he handed it to me, and his back is to the audience, and he said, well, okay. And the look was crash and burn. I figured nothing. And luckily, some muse whispered in my ear, and maybe it was the kid, in the face of the grumpy old, and not that Jack was grumpy, but it was like, it's classic movie 101. The audience went ape, because I did a whole thing about Joker, baboons, Junes, moons, prunes, whatever it was, and they went crazy. And Jack never said a word to me that day. And eventually they fixed the cameras and everything got worked, and we did the shows. And the next day I was down in the bullpen area, they call it, in between the stages. And I see Jack getting off the elevator. He's coming towards the studio, and I'm thinking, oh, bleep, I am in for it now. And he had never once said my name, because who am I? Some guy running around on stage. And as we got closer, I was going to say, hello, Mr. Barry. And he said, hey, Mark, why don't you come on up to the office next week and we'll talk about your future. And this was before the Bobby Lauer passing thing. And I went up and they offered me a job on a pilot of what became Hollywood's Talking. And there it was, again, a lot of gag material, because we wrote a lot of that stuff and force-fed it to the celebrities. So it sort of grew. It was throw in some ideas of Truth or Consequences, go to CBS, help with the warm-ups, work on Hollywood's Talking, Truth or Consequences writing. And then when I was doing Truth or Consequences writing, I only had to go in 2 days a week. We would go in and meet in the morning with Barker, pitch our ideas, and then we would tape those 2 days. Those are the only 2 days I had to go. So Jack, seeing now what I could do, hired me to sit in the contestant screening process. And once contestants were selected to be on the show, and they went through the standard interview to know what Jack could talk about with them, then they were sent to me, and I would look for jokes for Jack. And then I did it not just for Jack, but also years later for Wink, when they went into syndication and they were doing Tic-Tac-Toe and Joker. And the classic story I always tell is that I had a woman one day whom I was talking to and trying to get anything from her, and I got nothing. And I finally went somewhere I don't like to go because it's not talking about her. But I said, what about your husband? What does he do? What kind of work? And she said, he's a football player. He's a professional football player. And I said, what position? And she said, he's a split end. Well, no sooner did she say split end than I'm writing, how did he get that way? Did he shampoo too much? Right? Because that's a daytime joke. It's a pun. Jack loved them. And, a week later, we're in the studio, and I see that she's going to be one of the contestants. And I went and I looked at his cards, and sure enough, there's the joke, underlined in red. And Johnny Jacobs, another one, he should rest in peace, says, and here she is, Karen Zismiski. And she comes in, and Jack says, well, Karen, how you doing? I understand your husband's a football player. She said, yes. He said, what position does he play? And she said, he's a wide receiver. And I like to say that Jack said, did he shampoo every day? But he didn't. He just gave me a look like, what? So from that moment on, once they determined what somebody said, they'd make sure that's what they said. It wasn't like you fed them the line. They said it in the first place. So it was sort of this kind of movement of you pull along, then you pull along, you pull along. Eventually, stuff at Ralph Edwards Production became so fertile, so intense, that I went to Jack, or maybe Richard Kline, and said, I really can't help anymore with the warm-ups. I'm just working 5 and 6 days a week at Ralph Edwards Productions. And the inside information is there was a page at CBS who had by that point befriended me, was a guy who schmoozed everybody. And I told him I was leaving, and he said, could you put in a good word for me, and maybe I can take over doing the warm-up? And I said, absolutely. And that was a guy who was then known as Mark Berkowitz and is now known as Mark Summers. So I'm not revealing that he was once Berkowitz. And so I can tell you that Mark got his first warm-up job because of me, and he would have gotten it anyway, probably, but I put in a good word for Mark, and I consider him a friend still. And then, as a result, the next best step, and you haven't asked me a question in about 8 minutes, but
fine with me.
At a certain point, they gathered us all together, and we knew this was going to happen. But they said, Truth or Consequences is not going to go on. Because in those days, they had what was called a bicycle system. It's not day and date. They'd record the show, and then I think there were 5 tapes that were used for the whole country. And, at first, those first 5 tapes went to New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Detroit or wherever. And then there were instructions, mail this to Memphis and Chattanooga and Fresno or whatever. It took 2 years for those to bicycle through the system. So they had such a backlog that they went, there's no point. And I thought, well, I got to start looking for work. And the next day the phone rang, and Ralph himself personally said, would you be interested in staying and working in development? And I was more than honored. I was complimented and certainly grateful, and less worried because, there was also a paycheck. And I have Ralph Edwards to thank for that.
Could you describe what it's like to be in a development group for a distributor?
It's, first of all, it almost doesn't exist anymore, because now it's not what's the show, it's whom are you going to get to host it or something. But some of it was ugly, because people knew that, if you're getting paid by how many cantaloupes you can pick out in the field in an hour, then you're going to pick as many cantaloupes as you can. And if the guy next to you trips and falls, unfortunately, you if you're of that nature, you might not even help that guy up, because you want to be the one with the most cantaloupes, which is a polite way of saying that sometimes, as the old saying goes, success has many parents and failure is an orphan. So there were easily as many people who would be willing to shoot down an idea as there were people who would want to salvage an idea. I've heard stories that, and I never had to face this, that there were rooms where there was one person whose only job was to keep score, was to see how many ideas this person had versus how many ideas that person had. And I've certainly been in rooms where the mood was ugly, and frankly, I didn't appreciate it. At Ralph Edwards Productions, with the exception of one guy, I feel that I was in luxurious circumstances. And I think in part it was because Ralph had kind of grown complacent, because for many years he had Truth or Consequences, and he had these long-running shows and didn't have to worry about what's going to happen next. So there wasn't a staff of 2 or 4 or 6 people who sat down every day and threw ideas and competed to see whose idea was going to hit the table or stick to the wall. So I kind of was there on my own, and Ralph would call a meeting, and some of the other people were easily twice my age, 50s and 60s. And I think they kind of sat in awe. I'm not saying this with braggadocio, but I have a brain that just doesn't quit. So they kind of almost sat in awe of, wow, that's another one. And therefore, I was fortunate enough when I was, I think, 27, the first of my ideas ever to go to pilot went to pilot at NBC, and it was a thing called Equal Partners. It didn't sell. It might have sold under different circumstances, but it didn't sell. But I remember Ralph came in, I'm going to amend it. Let's say I was 28. But Ralph came into my office one day, and he said, Mark, I'm really proud of you that you got this pilot order from NBC, or we got the pilot based on your idea. He said, but you don't hold the company record for being the youngest person ever to get a pilot for a show. And I said, no? And he said, no, I was 27 when I sold Truth or Consequences. And I said, Ralph, if the only person I lose out to in this competition is you, I'm honored. And I really was honored. So, they listened to a lot of my ideas. There was one guy I worked for, doesn't matter who he is, who shot some of my ideas down, ideas that I put in my pocket and years later sold someplace else. Because there's no knowing. I can prove to you that ice cream has to be a certain temperature in order to be ice cream, but I can't prove to you that vanilla tastes better than strawberry. So much of television is just a matter of taste and arbitrary, hey, this works and this doesn't work. So for the most part, it was a joy, because every week I'd come in, or every day or whatever it was, I'd go, hey, what if? And then I'd have to prove that it could happen. I'd have to come up with the material to make it work. And that was a joy. So that was great. And I had 6 years of that with Ralph, and a couple of years at Warner Brothers with a guy named Jeff Edwards as a partner. We got one pilot done. One pilot. It didn't sell here, but it did sell in the UK. And then 6 more years working for Jack and Dan, I went back to them. They kept offering me jobs. Jack, by that point, Dan was, ensconced with Jack. And they offered me 6 different jobs. And finally, at a certain point, I was making so much money from them just doing the warm-ups that it was impossible to turn them down without me feeling like I would have somewhat damaged the relationship. And in that context, it was a different set of people in development, and some of whom you just had to kind of sit there as they bloviated, and maybe they felt the same way about me. And, of course, Danny was the hardest of all, because Danny would just arbitrarily say, no, that won't work, even if you knew in your heart and your gut it would. But again, he was the boss, and if you want the check, you have to take the dreck. So you do it.
Well, do you remember the first show that you ever created that went to air? First show?
Yes. It was a show called Knockout.
Describe that show.
Yes. Well, like any good show, even though this wasn't necessarily a good show, but a good format is one that is familiar to people in the first place. Wheel of Fortune, is Hangman. I'm going to tell you how it evolved, because I was so naive as to think I could just come up with something this quickly. Someone came in one day with an idea for a game, somebody from the outside. My boss called me in to listen to the pitch. When the pitch was done, and my boss said thank you, and the person left, he turned to me and he said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, this element they have, that once you answer a question, you're off the hook, and you don't have to answer any more questions. I think that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do in a game. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, I think it should be that if you answer a question, that gives you the right to challenge somebody else to answer a follow-up to that question. And he said, well, what kind of question do you mean? And I said, I don't know, but give me a day and I'll come back to you tomorrow. And that night, amidst being, I guess I wasn't, well, I was getting ready to be a daddy. So luckily I wasn't distracted yet. And I shouldn't say luckily, because there's no better distraction on the planet than my children. It's not a distraction, it's a joy. But I wasn't yet doing the stuff you had to do, and I had a chance to go home and just think about it. And then I went in the next day and said, here's what happens. And the way I said it to him was, that thing on the SATs where they go, here's 4 items and 1 doesn't belong. Cross out what doesn't belong. Okay? And he said, yeah, which is the same as Sesame Street. 3 of these things belong together. I said, well, implicit in that question is, even though it's a 1 out of 4 shot, if you're saying what doesn't belong, you're saying you know what the other 3 have in common. But you never actually state that on the SATs, right? So what if we showed 4 items to the contestants and somebody jumped in and said what doesn't belong, but didn't say what they have in common, but instead had the right to challenge somebody else to say what they have in common. And we called the show Knockout. And Artie Johnson was the host, and it had a 6-month run on NBC. And the biggest flaw was that I was writing material. Remember I said to you long ago about the Brussels sprouts?
Yep.
Okay, and I said I learned then the level at which you should write material. I was writing material for my friends, for people that I would want to have a conversation with. And I don't mean this from an elitist standpoint, but you have to think about who's home at 10 o'clock or 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning watching, right? So number one, I was writing stuff that was too smart for the crowd. Number two, these were the days of the heyday of Richard Dawson and Family Feud on ABC. And we were up against Family Feud. Now, I can't use that as an excuse because there's loads of people that have gone up against Family Feud and some lasted longer or whatever. But I think mostly it was a question of the material, the level of material, because it's an enticing kind of game, because they told us in testing that they had to keep shushing the people in the focus groups because they were shouting the answers to the screen. So Knockout with Artie Johnson as host was the first show of mine that ever went on the air.
And what year was that?
Well, I was 30, so it must have been 47 plus 3, 1977. I'm guessing it was 76 or 77.
Now, were you still working in contingency? You were still working with Ralph Edwards, but did you work on his other shows, Cross-wits, Name That Tune, in addition to those?
Number one, I'll go with the item of less interest. Cross-wits. Jerry Payne had done a pilot of that years before, and he now brought it to Ralph and said, I think we should do it. And the answer is yes. But in Jerry Payne's version of Cross-wits, there weren't 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 words on the board. It looked like more like the traditional crossword puzzle. There were 20 words or 25, but only some of them were clues. And I was the kid, and Jerry Payne had been a writer on Truth or Consequences. And till the day that we no longer saw each other, and I understand this, it's very difficult to let go of your perception of somebody in a relationship that you have. He always thought of me as the kid, the loud kid. So the loud kid said, the audience will never follow that some of these words are clues and some aren't. Because if you tune in the middle of the show and you see Nose and Brooklyn and Singer, but you also see Spaghetti and Saw and Meatloaf, you're trying to make sense of that, and it doesn't make sense. And they went through all kinds of shenanigans, including, well, we'll flash a box that says clue word when it's a clue word. And I just kept fighting for, no, it should only be all clues. And I will say I was resolute. I wasn't fighting to the point where I went, you can't do the show. It's not up to me. But I didn't let go of that. And then, so I will say the thing I felt was my contribution, and it's a small one. It's the old line about how do you do those sculptures? Well, I just take the pieces that don't belong and I carve them away. I kept saying you got to do a show where it's all clues. And they went with that. On Name That Tune, and by the way, I wrote, therefore, and again, Ralph was a signatory to the Writers Guild. So I made WGA money, which doesn't mean much maybe to your audience, but it made a heck of a difference for me because at my ripe old age, I'm still getting a pension from the Writers Guild because the dues I paid all those years ago. Name That Tune, a guy named Sandy Frank, who was a syndicator, had come to Ralph. He had probably gone to many other people. I don't know that, and I don't mean it as an insult, but Ralph might not have been his first choice. But he said to Ralph, I have the rights to Name That Tune, but I want a whole new show. because the old show was people in sneakers running and ringing a bell. That was all they did. And he said, I want a whole new format. So if we can make a business deal, part of it is that you have to come up with a new format. And they made the business deal, and Ralph called us in. And again, it was Jerry Payne, and I was there, and whoever else he had. And every day we'd be pitching this idea and that idea. And I came in one day and I said, what if they bid how few notes? Like an auction, like poker, you're bidding, there's some strategy. And they said, but based on what? I said, well, we'll give them a clue as to what the song might be, but just in the ballpark. And I think that became bid a note. And 6 months after the show went on the air, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the dinner dishes, and a commercial came on the air, and it was something like, I can name that sandwich in 3 bites. And I yelled to my wife, Melinda, I've become a cliche. And my reward, because I was working for Ralph, I told you he had offered me a job developing ideas. So I was not entitled to, and I would never complain, I was not entitled to any kind of a royalty for coming up with that idea. I was an employee, right? Mm-hmm. But my reward was I got to write for the first however many seasons. I wrote the bid a note clues. And I had loads of fun with those as well.
Favorite clues?
Oh, yeah. 2. The rule always was get them in the ballpark, get them thinking they almost know the song, but ultimately they can't know the song just from the clue, because then they'll just bid one note and the people at home just hear bing and there's no game. In fact, in many ways, it's sort of an anti-game show thing because you're excluding the viewer. But it was like get them in the ballpark. So the one I always loved that got them in the ballpark, and again, it's a question of when this was happening and what films were. And I wrote a clue that said, this is a majestic theme song that appears in a movie about the approach of an alien. I might even said an alien from outer space. I don't remember, right?
Right.
Well, in their head, they got it. They think. And they bid down to 3, and they're waiting for the Star Wars theme. And, of course, it was Superman. Okay. So that one, and by the way, it wasn't like I cheated them because Superman,
was an alien.
But the one that I loved it for a different reason. And it was, this is a song from a film about a woman who opens umbrellas and flies. Okay. And this is all about the disappearing comma. Because it was a song from Mary Poppins, right?
Right.
Who opens umbrellas and flies, but my little ha was she opens umbrellas and flies, which no one got, but I had my own little laugh at that point. So Ralph used me for as long as I was there, whatever shows they had. And in fact, when it came time, when Jeff Edwards and I got the deal at Warner Brothers, and I went in and told them, how thrilled I was to have worked for Ralph for so long, but it was time to graduate. He was very gracious. Within a week, a guy named Bruce Belland, who was then the producer of the Cross-wits, called me and said, does your deal with Warner Brothers allow you to still continue writing the clues for us on the Cross-wits? And I figured nobody ever said no. So for about 1.5 years or 2 years after I left Ralph Edwards Productions as a full-time employee, I still wrote the clues, not the clues, but the clues to the Cross-wits.
What was Way Out Games? I don't know if that
An abomination. No, that was fun. That, ladies and gentlemen, that was a joke. That was funny. That was ha ha ha. At the same time, I think there was a show. I'm forgetting now, but it might have been called Wild and Crazy Kids or whatever it was. But it made a big splash, I think, with ABC, and so MGM had done a pilot with, I think, Soupy Sales of Way Out Games. And the premise was that every week, 3 junior high school teams, 3 teams from junior high schools all across the U.S. would compete up at Magic Mountain. Some of the games They were all physical stunts. Some of them were done in the park on the rides, and some of them were done in a big grassy area with inflatable pools and dunk tanks and whatever. And I was first approached by Dan if I would come up and give them ideas for stunts. And that was, again, right up my alley. And I did do that, pitched ideas, and they loved a lot, and they didn't like some, and whatever it was. And then about, I don't know how long, maybe 2 weeks before they were going to go into production. Oh, and we found out that the host was going to be Sonny Fox. When I say we found out, Barry and Enright had gotten the network's approval to get Sonny Fox. And your audience may not know, but Sonny Fox was huge in kids' TV in the 50s. He was the host of a show called Wonderama when he was a young man. And so apparently they couldn't reach a deal with Soupy Sales to do the series on Way Out Games. And somebody said, hey, how about Sonny Fox? He's kids and everything else. And I think sight unseen, they made a negotiation over the phone. And then Sonny Fox showed up with a head full of white hair. I don't want to sound ageist because I'm 73 now, right? But in the day and age, here's Sonny, who A, is well past gung-ho time in his life, and B, nobody knew, was auditioning for the job of head of children's programming for NBC. He was either in negotiation or he was up for it, whatever. So they did some run-throughs, I guess, and Sonny Fox, who's now signed and locked in, is doing this like he's at a senatorial discussion. Dan Enright called me and said, in looking at the show, we think we need a second banana who can demonstrate the stunts and kind of be a comic foil to Sonny. Would you be interested in doing that? And then he probably was met with silence on the phone because by that time I had gotten in my car and was driving over to Barry and Enright to say yes. It was like the greatest thing that could have ever happened for me. And I was the second banana. And the show could have been, I think, successful, but it was burdened with promises that I think were difficult to deliver because they had to do a year's worth of shows. And those were, in those days, it was, I think, 26 episodes, and then they were repeated once, for the 52 weeks. They had to do 26 episodes in an obscenely short amount of time up at Magic Mountain, and they were just chopping and dicing and slicing and just doing everything as quickly as they could. So I paid for my house, and I was quite grateful, and I made some more wonderful I had wonderful experiences and learned a lot about TV, as I always did. And at the time, I was 29, but Dan wanted me to say I was 21. So that was Way Out Games.
What kind of hosting did you do, or how did you act? Did you try to engage in a different persona? Did you try to play off of Sonny Fox, or?
Well, first of all, I try to play off of Sonny Fox, and Sonny, if he hears this, it's said with love and respect. I think that from day one, Sonny might have been a bit irked that there even was somebody who was now going to be in that, even as co-host. It wasn't like we were equal, but even the fact that somebody was going to take even a bit of that circle, I think Sonny had expected. It was Sonny's gig, and the empirical evidence for that was we invited Sonny to our house to come. He was in from New York and staying at a hotel or wherever, and my wife and I invited him to come have brunch with us on what was either a Saturday or a Sunday, and then drive up to Magic Mountain where we're going to meet Dan and Richard Kline and walk through and talk through what the idea of the show was. And we had a wonderful brunch, and then we got in my car and I was driving him up, and he turned to me and he said, have you ever considered or have you ever worked in mime? And I kind of got, that was like all he had to say. That was it. And then in answer to what the character was, I just arbitrarily kind of was a little bit, hey, Sonny, what if we, hey? And I'm not sure if that was the right persona or not, because nobody ever gave me a note. Richard Kline, who was the director on the show and operated along with Dan, as he always did, in a production capacity as well, whatever the title, whether it was producer or whatever. Richard was calling so many of the shots beyond just as a director calling the shots, just whom we're going to staff and what we're going to do and how's it going to happen. It was never that they said to me, here's the bit that we have for you. It was, okay, so here's the competition. What are you going to do to make it funny? How are you going to demo it? Now, that was a luxury on the one hand, that I would just say, here's what I'm going to do. So then he'd see how he could cover it. But on the other hand, it was like, I sure wish somebody would have told me, well, that one doesn't work. That's not as good as this. But it was what it was. And it was fun. And that was the summer that I always say we were pregnant. My wife gave birth in October to our first child. And so it was a very exciting time. Very exciting time.
Quick glance at it, because you also worked on The New Truth or Consequences.
Yes.
What differences were there between The New Truth or Consequences and the original or the pre-Truth or Consequences?
Okay. So I start by saying that Bob Hilton is a talented, affable, charming, delightful, creative individual who went on to have a very substantial career in game shows. And then beyond that, I think he had a career in business. Yep. There is only one Bob Barker. There is only one Bob Barker. And Bob Barker could take a piece of paper and a pencil and a whistle and turn it into 8 or 12 minutes of very entertaining television, because he has instincts. Now, he's not the Bob Barker that we all cherished and remember, but, Bob Barker, in his strength, had the ability to make anyone shine and to take an act, an idea, and make it go beyond. So the difference was that in The New Truth or Consequences with Bob Hilton, we had to make sure that we had everything in place and ready to go so that he could just go through from number one to, it was paint by numbers, okay? So Bob Barker, here's the paints, here's the brushes, here's the canvas. He could do the picture for you. Hilton, which is still a difficult job to do, it was paint by numbers. Bob, you're going to go here, you're going to go there, you're going to go here, you're going to go there. He'd still give you the fun, the affability, but we had to plan it out a lot more.
We're skipping a little bit ahead in this, but I wanted to ask about Hot Potato, because I know you worked on Hot Potato, and that's one of my favorites. So that was 84. What do you remember about Hot Potato?
Well, I have a real long Hot Potato story, if you want to hear it, that involves the one time I've ever seen Bill Cullen get even testy.
I'm listening if you are.
All right. Bill Cullen, I just spent time telling you how marvelous Bob Barker was in his heyday. Bill Cullen, in terms of the humanity, in terms of it's better to make a friend than to make a joke, Bill Cullen is at the top of the list for me. And in fact, all those years earlier, Bill was the host of Equal Partners, the first pilot an idea of mine. It didn't sell, but I was so honored when I found it. I was so thrilled when I found out Bill Cullen was going to be the host. And every time I ever worked with Bill Cullen, it became more and more enjoyable. And I found I had wonderful visits with him and wonderful times with him. Hot Potato presented challenges because Dan had a certain sense of rhythm about the show. NBC and some of us, other people, had a different sense. And I think the show might have played better if we had moved it along a bit more. It was a little tedious because it was the rhythm that Dan was accustomed to. But that said, there we were in production, and the kind of death knell of a show was suddenly it was celebrity, whatever. Mm-hmm. The minute they brought in celebrities, you knew, oh, okay, they're in trouble. Even as a kid, I knew that, right? So we made the decision, instead of it being groups of 3 circus performers or 3 accountants or 3 priests or 3 pregnant women. We tried to get a pregnant man, but we just couldn't seem to do it. Suddenly we went to one, as I remember, it was 1 contestant, 2 celebrities. And it was Celebrity Hot Potato. And like every other game show, we weren't going to get the A-listers. We got the B-listers. But one day, everybody was very excited because they said, we have Milton Berle. Now, it's true this is not Milton Berle of 1956, but it's still Milton Berle. And you go, this is a great name. Milton Berle was doing it because his wife was a member of a charity called SHARE, SHARE. And it was a whole bunch of women who worked in Hollywood and many of the wives of men who worked in Hollywood. And they did they had a big banquet once a year, and they did their charitable, they did all their good stuff. And there's Milton. There was some office at NBC, don't ask me the name of it, that had to pass on the acceptability of any charity where you were going to both mention the charity on air and give money to that charity. Because what NBC was saying was, we're giving legitimacy, and if somebody says, you know, these are the sons of the carpet suckers I'm giving money to, and it suddenly turns out that those people did terrible things to carpets, NBC didn't want to be associated with that. So there was a book somewhere, and you'd have to call up or write or send a memo and say, here are the charities that the celebrities are doing this week. Are they all approved? And then somebody'd look in the book and say, yeah, you're fine. For some reason, SHARE had never been vetted, and it was going to take too long. So when Milton Berle showed up, they said to Milton, look, you can play for SHARE. When you win the money will go to SHARE, but you just can't say it on the air. Okay? Well, this is Milton Berle. You don't tell Milton Berle anything. So Milton Berle, every time they go to him, says, yes, and I'm so happy to be here. It's almost like he's goading us, playing for SHARE, right? And at first, and Bill knows he's not supposed to do it, so at first Bill is taken aback a bit. And we have a stop down for commercial. And Richard Kline comes up with what he thinks is a great solution. He said, fine, just let him say it, and we'll just bleep the audio, right? Not even bleep. We'll just dump the audio. Well, so now Milton winds up going, yes, I'm just playing for, and now you see the SH. And that sets up what now happened. It was, as they said in A Tale of Two Cities, the best of times and the worst of times. Because this was the day when in the middle of our taping, there was all kinds of whispering going on stage. And even though somebody said I shouldn't know because they were afraid it was going to interfere with what I had to do, this was the day that Jack Barry turned up missing. He was in New York City. And he was missing. And at first he was only missing, and by the time we finished, we knew he was dead. All right? Alan Koss and I were working in tandem producing the show. Alan, once we went to celebrities, Alan took over working with the contestants because there was only two contestants per show, right? There wasn't the big load. And I pretty much handled the celebrities, along with the fact that I was putting together the material in the first place with Alan. You know, we worked on material together, but in the studio, he was wrangling contestants, I was wrangling celebrities. And then I find out, on top of everything else, that, you know, something's gone on with Jack, and so we're all kind of distracted. But at this point, we don't know that he's gone, that he's dead, so we're continuing on. We're soldiering on. At one point, Milton calls me over. Maxwell, come here. Luckily, we're in a break. He wasn't in the middle of it. Okay. And he said, there's something wrong with the speakers in the audience. And I said, why do you say that, Milton? He said, because the audience isn't hearing my jokes. They're not laughing at them. And, you know, it took all the self-control in the world not to say, Milton, they're hearing them. They just ain't funny anymore. Okay. We go to a commercial break, and Bill calls me over. And Bill is the most charming man I've ever met. And Bill says, Mark, you either get Milton to control himself, or I'll go wait in my dressing room until he does. And he said it that calmly and that nicely, and it wasn't a threat. It just was impeding his ability to be a host. He couldn't do his job. So I went over to Milton. I, to this day, don't remember what it was I said, but I think it was a whole pep talk about how great he is. And because he is so good, he's outshining the others. And so, you know, if he could pull back a bit, that would help these other people who are nowhere near as funny as he. It would help them not look so bad. And for whatever reason, he pulled back a bit, and we were doing fine. But there's a bit of karma in the story, and that's why I tell you the story. So Bill was fine, I was fine, and Milton was fine. And one of the questions we had was, we have the list of the 7 or maybe it was 10 celebrities whose faces have appeared most on TV Guide. And Milton just got this look on his face. He was glowing and gloating. And when it came to him to give the answer, he simply said, "Oh, of course, Milton Berle." And Bill took the most wonderful pause, and only he and I knew what was going on in his head. And he looked down at the card one more time, and he said, "Milton, nope, sorry, go sit down." Milton was not on that list, because by then, it was past his sell-by date. Yeah, in the 50s and even the 60s, Milton Berle, but this was the 80s. Milton had gone past his date, but Josh, Bill handled it brilliantly. He handled it brilliantly.
Well, speaking of Bill Cullen, he's considered one of the greatest game show hosts of all time, and you just described one of the reasons why he is. What do you think are the qualities of a good game show host?
Joke. What did you just say? No, that's a joke, because that's the first quality, and that's to listen. And to be able to change in midstream and go with the flow of what's going on. I hated, and I'm not going to comment about some current people, but when they started going, "Oh, let's get a comedian," and then you'd watch as the wheels were spinning in that guy's head, going, "Well, what's my next punchline? What can I do that's going to be funny?" The light is not supposed to be on you. The light's supposed to be on the contestant. And Bill did that so well. You always felt he was there to make life better for you. And that's, for me, is number one. And number two, which is the sidebar to that, is that sense of, I relate to each of you. We are of the same stripe. I'm not bigger or better than who you are. Here's the thing. There's some people whom I've worked with who don't fill this last requisite. Some of them are, forgive me, dumber than a stick, but they just exude an aura that makes you think they understand what's going on. But I think that it's what I always liked was working with somebody who understood what a game was, so that they could look for the high points and enhance it. But not everybody could do that. And one of the best game show hosts ever was somebody who unfortunately only got one shot at it, and that was Betty White. She was so good on a terrible, terrible show called Just Men, but she was good. And she also did the pilot. I don't know if you know this, but she did the pilot of what became Hollywood's Talking. And there was supposedly just a whole bunch of resentment of her ability. But to be quick-witted, it's one thing to be able to come up with a joke. It's something else to know when not to do it. And Bill and Betty and Barker, I guess it's only people who are B's maybe, and Bonte Ball, are people that knew when not to do the joke, which is just as important as to know what joke to do. So I think those are some of the elements.
Do you think Wink Martindale has those?
Wink certainly has the ability to connect with every person who ever comes on that stage, and to make that person feel vaunted and honored and respected. And he has a charm and a likability, and I certainly have had nothing but great experiences with him. See, here's what Wink can do that's so good. If you're working with Wink and he trusts you, he might not understand, and I don't mean this as a slur, he might not understand what it is that you give him, but if he trusts you, he'll do it, and he'll own it. Going back all those years ago when I told you that I was writing gags for the interviews, this goes back so long ago that a contestant came on and bragged about the fact in the interview that she was writing a book using a word processor, all right? If you even know that term. And Wink said, "Well, that's interesting." Wink via me, or me via Wink. Wink said, "That's interesting because my wife Sandy and we're writing a cookbook using a food processor." And I think to this day he doesn't know what that joke was, but he sold it. He sold it. He made you believe, that it was coming from him, and that's all he needed to do. But he himself will say that there were times when the category was foreign words, and he turned around to the board and tried to unscramble a foreign word or whatever it might have been, But we all have those lapses. We all have those lapses. Very, very charming, delightful, caring man.
And was tic-tac-toe when you first worked with him?
Yes. And the funny thing about tic-tac-toe and Wink was, you just reminded me of a funny story. Do you know what the NATP convention was? National Association of Television Programming Executives. And once a year they'd all get together, and that's where a lot of the syndicated programs were sold to the station managers. And Wink knew me as Max because when I did warm-ups, I in an effort to create a persona, I would just tell the audience that my name was Max. And he knew me as Max, and he was warm and gracious and charming and affable, and we would start doing gags together, and it was all the old burlesque gags like, hey, congratulations on the boat. What boat? Well, your wife says you're getting a boat. She says I'm getting a boat? Yeah, I spoke to her the other day, and she says you're getting a little dinghy. Stupid jokes like that. Well, he would do all that stuff with me, and he treated me with great respect, and who was I? And he didn't even know that I had a totally different career developing and selling and producing shows. He only knew me as the warm-up guy. And there I was. I ran into him at NATP, and he goes, "Hey, Max. Hi, Max. How you doing, Max?" And a third person came up, somebody we both knew, but, separately. It was Paul Gilbert or whoever it was. Paul, let's say it was Paul, said, "Hi, Wink. Hi, Mark." And Wink's looking around. Who's Mark? Where's Mark? Because he just knew me as Max. And then he discovered that I had more than one name. So that's my Wink story. There's many more. Wink was very kind to me. A couple of years ago, some game show congress honored Wink, and he was going to get up and talk. And he told me about it. And maybe I said, "Hey, you should let me do the warm-up for you." And I was kidding. And he said, "Yeah, that'd be great." So I did a warm-up in front of all these TV professionals, and I had two lines that I was very proud of. One was that I was honored to be asked to sit, not only to be here today, but to sit at Wink's table until I found out that one of the reasons he had me here was to chew his food. Because you don't waste teeth like that on eating, And then so he laughed at that, and everybody laughed. And I said, "Wink, don't laugh too hard. You'll crack your hair." And those are my two Wink jokes. And he's a generous enough guy that I could tell you that I did them, and I could tell you that I did them in front of him. And he laughed louder than anybody. Very nice man.
He credits you with coming up with the name for the show Bumper Stumpers. Do you take credit for that?
I accept it, and I know that I did. And the funny part is that he had a name that in today's market would have been better. His name then was License to Steal. And again, however many years ago it was, Danny kind of thought like, steal, License to Steal. We can't, right? We have to come up with something else. And we were sitting in Dan's office, and I don't remember if Wink was even in this meeting or not, but Danny said, we need a new title. Anybody that's ever worked for Dan Enright, we'll do a Dan Enright impression for you at some point. He said, we need a new title. And what my mind went was, what are all the different parts of a car? And I literally was visualizing a car, and I went, the bumper. Bumper Stumpers! And that was it. I went Bumper Stumpers, and they all loved it. And it's not a bad title, Bumper Stumpers. Not a bad title at all.
Can you describe that show and describe writing for it?
Yeah, the show, again, was really riddles, puns, plays on word. Because Wink and Sandy had been driving in L.A. somewhere, and they were behind a car that had a personalized license plate, and they kept following it. I think they probably missed their turnoff on the freeway because they were trying to figure out what the license was. They just couldn't unscramble it. And I think they finally stopped at a light and pulled up and asked the guy what it meant. And so that made him think, wow, there could be a game in just unscrambling license plates, personalized license plates. Like somebody will have 10 S N E and the number 1, right? So tennis anyone. So that was what he had. And he brought me and Dan and Alan Koss, he brought us to a townhouse that he had at that time in what is called Century City, which is where the old 20th Century Fox lot was. And by then he and Sandy had moved out, but they were still holding on to it. And he had set up an easel and he showed us the puzzles. And we all said, yeah, there's something here. But he had a format that was untenable in terms of how he played the game. And for me, I always like what I call spewing, where somebody's trying to sound something out, because when you're trying to sound it out, you don't hear what you're saying, but everybody else around you hears it, and therefore they're ahead of you in the process. So I came up with the notion that we'd show 2 license plates, one of which had no meaning at all, and there were 2 people on the team, and the question was, which one of these 2 license plates belongs to a, we'll say, carpenter, right? And one member of the team could jump in and say it's plate A or plate B, but now the other member of the team was the one who had to sound it out. And the premise was, you figured that guy or gal didn't yet know what it was, and now with the letters and numbers in front of her or him was trying to sound it out, which kind of gave the viewer a bit of a head start on it. So then you'd get somebody going, why are you silly? So why are you silly? Why are you silly? Or whatever the thing may be. And I think that was the fun. That was the energy of the show. The Canadians still love it. It's in reruns all over Canada, and they keep talking about bringing it back, but I don't know if that'll ever happen.
Were you writing in the U.S., or did you actually go to Canada?
U.S.
Okay.
We went to Canada to do run-throughs, and for the first few episodes I went, but then I had a busy plate and other people would go, but we still were coming up with puzzles down in the U.S.
In between then or after then, shortly there, and I know this is a bit of a change in pace, but you did appear in an episode of Too Close for Comfort as a comedy club host. What do you remember about that?
Well, again, generosity. My gosh, there's a few names I'm not going to mention because they're people who keep me up at night because I get angry, not at them, but at myself for not telling them what they should do with their attitude. But they're not important to me. What's important is that I was a Jimmy Bullock fan before anybody knew who Jimmy Bullock was, or Jim J. Bullock. We were doing run-throughs of a show at Ralph Edwards, and this guy showed up one day, and I thought, who or what is that? And the minute he opened his mouth, I went, that is a star to be. And that was Jim Bullock. So years later, I was doing very well with game shows, and I was doing well with warm-ups, and Jim Bullock said to me, we really could use you on our show. The warm-up is not really working out. And there was a series of circumstances where Fox had a show that they wanted me to do the warm-up on, and they guaranteed me they would even pay me the weeks the show was off the air, because those shows would take hiatus weeks because they wanted me that much. And what business affairs at Fox never factored in was that the show would get canceled altogether. So I had done 8 or 9 shows or whatever it was, but was guaranteed 13 weeks worth of money, and the show got canceled. So I had a free Friday, and I was also getting paid, so I could tell Jimmy Bullock if they wanted me, I was available. And I did it, and the Taftner people, the people who did the Ted Knight show, loved what I did, and so they offered me the warm-up on that show, and I did it for many years. And one day, the writers just came to me and said, we have a very small part, but we think you'd be good for it. And I said, when do I audition? And they said, you already have, because you're the host of a comedy club. And I had all of, I think, 2 or 3 or 4 lines. Every once in a while, I get a check for $1.80. But I remember in rehearsal, Ted Knight, who was always so gracious, Ted Knight, the director was just there to get it on tape because Ted knew what he was doing. I'm sure he had blocked it. That by the time I show up, they had already been in rehearsal in the studio for 3 days or something, because they'd work the whole week and then they'd shoot on Friday night. And So the director didn't have very many notes for the other people, and my part was so small that I literally at one point just said to the audience, "I'm in the next scene, folks. I'll be right back." And I did the bit that I was going to do in rehearsal. And Ted just said, "Mark, come here," or Max, I guess. He said, "Don't move on the line. You do the move, and then you do the line, or you do the line, and then you do the move. But if you move on the line, you're going to take away from the line." And that's all he told me. And he was right. And it was, on the night, we did the dress rehearsal, and then we did the tape show. We did one take. We did only one take, I remember. And they loved it. And in my role as a smart alecky comedy club host, I got to insult Ted Knight. So that's what I remember about that. It was not a big deal, but it was fun. I did one other thing where I was a warm-up guy on a show, by the way. There was an AFI comedy special. They had a big competition to have people submit original scripts for possible sitcoms. And in the course of an hour, I think they did 3 of these separate episodes and showcased a whole bunch of brand new writers, but they had talent, by the way. At the time, Jean LaRoquette was one of the people in my sketch. And don't ask me what I was doing, because I never understood it, but I got a call from the guy who was the line producer of the show, and he said, "We're doing this show, and Aaron Rubin, or whoever it was, knows your work, and he wants you to do the warm-up for this AFI comedy special. Are you available on this night?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, look, can you come on down to wardrobe? When are you available for wardrobe?" And I said, "Wardrobe? I'm doing a warm-up, don't I wear my..." He said, "No, but you're in the show. In addition to doing the warm-up, you're going to play a warm-up guy in the show." And I you could hit me over the head with that script. I still don't understand what the script was, but somehow I was playing a warm-up guy, and then I went back to doing the actual warm-up. It was an AFI comedy special. I don't know. I don't remember the name of it.
Do you remember what year it was?
No. I just know John LaRoquette still had brown hair. And Jeannie Kasem was in it as well. Casey Kasem's widow. She was in it as well. I'll tell you this much. Brandon Tartikoff was the head of programming at NBC at the time.
1987 is what I'm seeing right now. So
it could well be.
Okay. Yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2 Run, another Canadian show.
Right.
What do you remember about that?
It was done for $1.50.
American or Canadian?
It was done for 12 cents. That was a surprise, because whichever Bill Elliott it was had I think this is what happened. We were doing Talk About already up in Vancouver, and I had a meeting with Bill Elliott, either because he said he was looking for a kids game. I think he said he was looking for a kids game. I pitched him the idea of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 run, and it was in the days when Mark Summers was doing so well in Double Dare. So everybody wanted to do their version of Double Dare, right? So I went out to the station in Burnaby or whatever, and I pitched him an idea. And he said, "Okay, fine, yeah, yada, yada." And then I'm guessing 2 or 3 weeks or a month later, I got a phone call from him. And I think this was the famous phone call when I thought it was the other Bill Elliott. And then I realized it was the Burnaby Bill Elliott, the West Coast Bill Elliott. And he said, "Can you come on up? When can you come up to Vancouver? Because I want you to talk with my staff about 5, 4, 3, 2 Run." And we discussed dates, and I spoke to my bosses, and that was the Taffner people, and got permission to get a plane ticket. And I went up to, and I hate to do this, I'm putting air quotes, or I'm putting in bold. I went up to discuss 5, 4, 3, 2 Run, and sitting around the table, he had all of the various department heads, audio and engineering and video and shops and stuff. And he looks at these people and he said, Mark is going to describe to you this pilot we're doing. And it took everything I had not to go, pilot? You know? I still, by the way, I'm 73. I still get excited, right? But this guy's going, pilot. And I remember I kind of like took a nice deep breath and I was talking. And then I went, excuse me, which way is the restroom? And I went in to the restroom and I went, pilot? You know, I was like, I didn't know we were doing a pilot. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is we did a pilot. It was a piece of crap. And here's why it was a piece of crap. Have you seen the show at all?
I could not find any footage.
Okay. So here was how the show worked. In the ultimate show that you saw, we picked kids out of the audience, and we did pick them directly out of the audience. When it started, there were, I think it was 4 kids in one round of the show. And we'd say the subject is superheroes who wear a cape. And the possibilities are Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and Robin, we'll just say for now, all right? Now, what the kids knew was one of them was incorrect. And those answers were being displayed on video monitors that were wedged in sort of like a seat or a throne. So then the host would say, so what you want to do is sit in a chair that is the right answer, but if you sit in a chair that's the wrong answer, you're going to pay a price and you're going to get a penalty will hit you over the head, all right? So then we'd go 5, 4, 3, 2, run, and the kids would run. And if they were sitting and we'd give them a chance to trade if they want, and sometimes they would and sometimes they wouldn't. And then the wrong answer would get stuff dumped on him. But what we saw in the pilot was every single time you'd say 5, 4, 3, 2, run, if the kid was in position 1, he just ran to the chair that was directly opposite position 1, if I'm making any sense. You know, if he was at the north end of the studio, he ran to the north chair, and the kid at the south end ran to the south chair. And there was no mixing them up. We looked at the pilot, and I would be the first one to say it wasn't working. So what we inserted was every time, in order to get from one side of the stage where you started out to the other side of the stage where you ran to sit in the chair, there was a physical feat that all of them had to accomplish, as in there's a garden hose laid out in front of you. You have to lay down and roll yourself up in the garden hose. Or there's a marshmallow on the floor and you have to push the marshmallow with your nose. And that worked because then they got all mixed up and some kids went slower than others and some went faster. And it played and it was fun. But the other thing was we had to do it very quickly. We only had so much time in a day to do so many shows. And I made the judgment that if every one of the drops we did on the kid's head was a mess, was a slime, was wet, a wet drop, we'll say, it took that much longer to clean it up in between each question. So instead, we did a lot of what I'll call dry drops, a box of, not a box, but 10 pounds of cereal or straw or whatever it was. That ain't funny. So they did it for 2 years. The kids loved it. I think the BCTV loved it, and they got it on the network, and they were happy with it. And I got the guy who hosted the second pilot and therefore the series was a marvelous guy named Andrew Cochran, who went on to become a lawyer, and we had loads of fun. But we did him real down and dirty, as you would say.
You brought up Talk About, and I know you said that you have a lot to say about Talk About. Let's just say, how did you sell Talk About?
I only got one turn down on Talk About before it got sold. What had happened was I'd been working by then, Jack had passed and I was working for Danny and Danny tried every way he could to make it work to accommodate me, because by that point it was getting to be not the clash of egos, but, I had a sense of what I thought would work. He had a sense of what he thought would work. And he kept trying to make it so that everybody was happy. But at the time, game shows were doing very well. And I don't want to sound like a big shot, but I was working for Barry Enright, but it was Danny only. And I had offers from 3 different entities as my contract was winding down, to go work for them. And I wasn't even quite sure whom I was going to work for, but the good news was that we had just pitched something to NBC, and they commissioned a pilot. So I was in a really good place with Dan, and I thought, this is the best time to tell him this. And I went in one day and I said, I've learned so much from you, and you're such a great teacher, and you go to school only so long, and then it's time to graduate. And maybe he even said to me, where are you going to go? And I said, I can't really talk about it. And the reason I couldn't talk about it was I hadn't yet decided where I was going to go, because there were these 3 different offers. But I just knew it was only fair to him to give him a month's notice. I wasn't going to give him just 2 weeks. I gave him a month's notice. And we had this pilot that was hanging, that we had, gotten a commitment to. And I said, but for continuity, if you want me to, I will stay on through the pilot. And he said, okay, let me think about that. And then what I found out was that, and I don't blame him, he spent a couple of days just calling everybody in town saying, are you available to work on a pilot? and I guess they all said no. So he came back to me and we worked out a deal. And by this time, or whatever it was, I pretty much knew I was going to go to work for Don Taffner. We worked out a deal that we would continue, after my contract was up, I would continue working only on the pilot at a prorated basis, but just on a pilot, and I wasn't working on any new stuff for Enright. And in fact, if they had development meetings, I was not invited, understandably. I'm going from Macy's to Bloomingdale's or something. So I'm working only on the pilot. But then Danny called me in one day after a meeting with NBC where I had a whole bunch of ideas. And he said, I really need to make sure that when this show sells, that the network doesn't think that I can't do it without you. So from now on, don't make any more suggestions in meetings. And in my head, I'm going, what am I wasting my time here for? That's okay. But what I did was to think positively. And I thought, well, when I started Taffner's, I want to hit the ground running. I want to have a property that is just so spectacular. And I had worked on a number of different ideas, just like I told you with Bumper Stumpers, which is, a year or two before then. But even long before that, when I was at Ralph Edwards, I had worked on a number of properties where it wasn't that, what is the answer? Give us one answer. You're either wrong or right. It was, how can you be partially right? How can you get some of the answer? How can you get 3 out of 5 or whatever it was? And I tried many different ways to do that, including one that I pitched to Dan, that it was like, how many words about Abraham Lincoln or something? And he said, yeah, that's great. But instead of just coming up with the words arbitrarily, can't you go to the person you're talking about? And I said, well, that's great if you're talking about, pick a star at the time. But how are you going to talk to Lincoln? I worked on a number of things where there were lists of words, just like Family Feud had a list of words. And nothing ever satisfied Dan, and he, luckily for me, dismissed it. So now I'm faced with a lot of time on my hands. I'm faced with go to meetings and not be allowed. If my opinion is asked, I can offer it, but I'm not supposed to just volunteer an opinion. And I'm trying to do everything I can to be productive, and I'm not going to be bitter about it. I'm thinking I'm going to spend my time thinking about what I do for Taffner's. And I went back to my list idea, and somehow out of the blue it hit me. The words that I don't say about a subject become the clue for what you get to guess. And without going into more detail, I'm assuming that you know the talk about format. I went home and I told my wife, who is my sounding board, who knows about game shows what I know about her healing crafts. I know that she does it and she does it well, but beyond that, I don't know it. But she could understand, wow, that sounds great. Now I'm chomping at the bit. I want to pitch it, but I can't pitch it because I'm still working for Dan, even though I'm only working on the pilot, which, by the way, never sold anyway. So that meant when I got to Taffner's, I'm ready. And I pitched the idea to my boss, and he said, don't even have to pitch it. We brought you on to start a game show division. Whatever you want to do, that's what you do. So I set up a meeting at NBC, The guy at NBC heard the pitch, and either I didn't do a good job of pitching it, or he just had a mindset. And Jay Wolpert had a show that was either just on or going to go on. I think it was called Sound Off, and it didn't last very long. And this guy went, "Oh, it's just like Sound Off." And once again, I tried one or two passes, and then when somebody's kind of slammed the door, right? I went, "Okay, fine." And my boss called me, the boss in New York, a guy named John Fitzgerald, who was my rabbi at Tafner's. And he said, "We're going to bring you up to Canada. We want you to pitch some ideas to the CBC." And I pitched 2 ideas to Carol Reynolds, this programming person at the CBC. And she said, "Which one of those 2 do you like better?" She says to me. And I'm smart enough to say, I have 2 daughters. And one is a really good dancer, and the other does wonderful acting stuff in school. And they're both good, but in different ways. So it's what do you want? What works for you? And I got one of the luckiest things ever, which was that the CBC paid for development deals on both of the ideas. One was talk about, and the other was a thing that I called buzzwords. It gave me the budget to bring about 2 or 3 people with me, and we did run-throughs for them for a guy named Yvonne Fitzon, who was the head of the network. And it was supposed to be, I knew we were in competition with other people. What I didn't know was one of the people we were in competition with was Danny Enright. If I had known that, I think I would have been too nervous. And we were trying to get a pilot deal on Talk About. And they came back and they did not give us a pilot on Talk About. Instead, they committed to 26 weeks on air. And that was a really good stroke of luck, because then we first had to learn how to do the show the right way. And we had many pitfalls. But there was not a person I met at the CBC who was not madly in love with that show, because it brought them to a whole different level. And as recently as within the last 2 or 3 months, I was interviewed for a documentary that they did in Canada on Canadian game shows. And Talk About is seen as, we'll just say, a step apart from. We won't say better than or worse than, but just such a different rhythm, such a different attitude, such a different energy than some of the stuff that they were accustomed to. And that show would have gone forever in Canada, but after 2 years, the CBC hit a $135 million shortfall, and they were not able to afford to continue funding the show, because the premise was supposed to be that we bring it down here and we sell it in syndication here, and they get to split the profits because they fronted the money for the show. But it took a while before that show took off and became a bit of a cult hit on the USA Network, as I understand it. But it did sell in England and Ireland, in Sweden. There was a bad version in France, and it was ripped off. It was even in Japan, and it was without our knowledge. But somebody made me aware of it. I had a piece of tape once of the Japanese version of the show. So one of my favorite shows.
Talk about Wayne Cox.
Yeah, Wayne Cox and I just had a Skype conversation within the last 2 weeks. He's a charming, delightful man who broke my heart. And when I say he broke my heart, it's because once we sold the idea to the Canadians, we had to get somebody to host the show. I know this is more ego than I'm entitled to, but having had a track record of having been the co-host on Way Out Games, I thought, well, I have a chance. But I'm not Canadian, so I thought maybe we do one of those things where we get somebody to be a second banana. But they set me up in a basement studio at the CBC in Vancouver, and people kept showing up, attempting to host the show, and I tried to give them every help I could, and I went, it ain't going to happen. And then in came Wayne Cox, and 13 seconds into it, I went, we got our host. So when I say he broke my heart, it's because there went my hosting career, which, by the way, wouldn't have happened anyway. But Wayne is so delightful, so charming. And by the way, this is a great example. He can be funny. He makes jokes, but he's not a jokester. He's not a comic. He's a charming man who would take whatever direction you gave him and would make people feel that they were, and he did really, it was legitimate with him. Sincerely, he cared about the people. He cared about the people.
Was that Vancouver or Toronto? That was Vancouver, right?
We did the run-throughs for Evan Fitzan in Toronto. And then, luckily for me, when they committed to the series, they said we have this huge building in Vancouver that mostly goes unused, and that's where they did the show, in Vancouver. And we would only do 5 a day, and we usually do 2 days in a row, maybe 3. And I wanted to show them they could save some money. So I pushed, and on one day, we did 7 shows. But just to show them we could do 6, right? But we did 7 in a day. And I think this was year 2. It was not year 1. And I got a memo. And the CBC, no wonder they had a shortfall. The CBC person said, we appreciate, and by the way, part of it was selfish. I didn't want to have to be up there as much. I wanted to be with my family who were down here. But the memo said, thank you for your industriousness and your ingenuity, but we have this crew that's sitting there waiting to work on shows. This is in the days when they had people on staff. And if you're not there doing the show, they have nothing to do. So let's only do 5 a day.
From your experience as an American, are there any differences between working in America and working in Canada on their game shows?
Well, first of all, here's Mr. Persnickety. They're Americans. They're North Americans. Okay, that's me being Mr. Persnickety. But since they would say Canadians and Americans just as well, you'll forgive me for being sassy pants for a minute. I had some of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had working with those crews in Vancouver. Marvelous women and men who only wanted to please. I used to say on certain shows at NBC, again, when they had staff, when it wasn't just a 4-wall situation, when they'd have staff, there were people who had what I called the Winnebago mentality. And that mentality was, whether or not this show works doesn't matter to me because another show will be here next week and I'll still make the money to buy my Winnebago, right? There were nice people, there were good people, but a lot of them, you were just another face that showed up and you were going to be gone. And it's wrong to paint with such a broad stroke because most of the people down here were people who cared as well and who would make suggestions and be supportive. But up in Canada, the enthusiasm I always found was even greater in terms of a general rule. They just wanted to make it work, and they did. And I'm still in touch with some of not the crew, but the staff people who worked on both Talk About and 5432 Run.
Coming back to America, you worked on Family Figures with the Van Peebles.
Yes.
Could you quickly describe that show, and could you quickly describe working with both Van Peebles, Sr. and Jr.?
I was so happy to be able to do a show for Black entertainment television. So I'm not saying BET. I'm saying for Black entertainment television. Because a game show is a game show is a game show. And if they wanted to do a game show at BET, I thought, here's a chance to get a lot more people on TV who might not always be on TV. Now, it was late enough in the game that it's not like I was not a trailblazer. I was not a groundbreaker. I was not anybody who was doing something that hadn't been done before. We were just doing more. So the families were marvelous. The families were marvelous. Melvin Van Peebles is someone who was of the opinion that he didn't need anybody to tell him what to do or how to do it.
When did you first meet Bob Boden?
Bob Boden may not remember this, but a marvelous woman named Bianca Pino called me one day, and she said, look, there's this kid, this young man, who's just come in from New York. He might not have lived that far away from where you lived in Queens, but he's a big game show freak, and he'd love to meet you. Are you willing to meet him? I don't know how she got to meet him, but she said, are you willing to meet him? I said, by all means. So we set up, I guess it was a lunch. I think it was one of the first of many lunches people have paid for Bob Boden if you haven't heard that line, you're hearing it now. It's an industry joke that Bob Boden has had people pay for lunch for him for years. And I don't mean it in a nasty way. It's just having a little fun with him. But Bob Boden then proceeded, when we met, oh, you know what? It wasn't a lunch. We were doing probably Knockout at NBC. And she said, could he come by and, and just talk to you at the studio? Because she was working on Knockout as well. So it wasn't a phone call. It was, it's so long ago, I didn't remember. But I know it was Bianca Pino. And he came and we talked. And he reminded me of things that I had done that I didn't remember doing, that he knew stuff about my career. So that was the first time I met him. And then, like everybody else in the business, it's revolving doors, and you spend 13 weeks with somebody or 13 minutes, and then you don't see him for 2 years, and then you go and you work with him on something else. And he is somebody who has managed to survive. He has, I guess he works his Rolodex and makes the phone calls and makes sure that people know who he is and what he can bring to the table.
Was Think Twice a pleasant experience with him?
I have to bifurcate the question.
Go for it.
Bob Boden and Mike Bevan understood game shows, and we understood each other. Now, it is true, when I brought in one idea one day, they both looked at me and said, well, yeah, you could do that, but nobody else could do it. And we got into a little bit of an argument or disagreement. It wasn't a screaming match or anything. And we had to do a run. They were kind enough, kind is the wrong word, because we were, all partners on this thing. They were patient enough. We staged it, and they saw it could be done. And I'll get back to what the game was in a minute. But the part that was a frustration was that the people in Boston didn't know a game show from a colander, And they kept sending this woman out who was one of their producers who would work with us, and it was a layer that we didn't need. And then she had a boss who had, I think, even less of an understanding. So the development out in L.A. and the run-throughs in L.A., once we got past the stuff that the people in Boston wanted to do what they thought was creativity, and then we could develop a real show, it was fun bouncing ideas back and forth. Yeah. But the layers of Boston and the PBS kind of stuff, that was more challenging. But, Bob and Mike, we all spoke the same language.
You did a couple of shows that you produced in the UK. Now, were you actually in the United Kingdom when you produced these shows, or did you just sell them?
No, quite. It depends on the show, but I did spent a lot of time. One of the story is that when I was doing Beat the Clock for, it was the Gary Kroger Beat the Clock that we did in Florida for,
PAX?
No, well, it's for PAX, thank you, which I guess is now Ion. Those are those stations. But when we did it, I got a phone call one day from, I'm forgetting the name of the big company that owns every game show there is now, the one that bought out Goodson.
Fremantle,
thank you. I totally blanked on Fremantle. So I got a call one day from Jeff Merkin, who was the guy who brought me in to Beat the Clock, or somebody from Fremantle called and said, we have an English producer coming to see you and how you do the show, because we want to do Beat the Clock in England as well. I said, that's fine. And, somebody set up the whole thing, and I shook hands with this guy, whatever his name was, and he said to me, and I won't do the accent because I can't do it very well. I'll sound like Dick Van Dyke if I do. He said, are you related to the Mark Maxwell-Smith? This is what he said. Are you related to the Mark Maxwell-Smith, who's a big game show producer in England? And I said, I didn't know there was a Mark Maxwell-Smith. And then I went, wait a minute. What are some of the shows you talk? And he went, well, Talk About and Humdingers and, whatever it was. And I went, oh, and certainly Chain Letters. And I went, you know what? I am that Mark Maxwell-Smith. So it depended on the show. Chain Letters, when they did that one over there, I went over for the initial pilot, got to meet Jeremy Beadle, had a wonderful time with him. A thing called Pass the Buck, which was sold by Jeremy Fox. Odd One Out. Those was, I just would get a check. I didn't have much to do. As I said, on Chain Letters, I was there for the pilot. But on Talk About, by then, that was the Taftners, and they had a hands-on producing entity in the UK. And I was there for every episode of Talk About that ever happened. And I was going to say earlier, in addition to Wayne, somebody with whom I'm still not just in contact with, but whom I consider a dear friend, is Andrew O'Connor. And Andrew was the host of Talk About in the UK. And the great story there was, we did a pilot of Talk About with somebody who will go nameless. And it was, once again, the commissioning body at the ITV called up or wrote or whatever and told the Taftners, we like the show, we want to do the show, but you have to get a different host. This host isn't working. And it's not fair to the guy to say who it was. But I knew he wasn't working. It wasn't my call to put him in, and there was nothing we could do on the day. We had whom we had. But they said we needed a new host. So we went on a host quest, and another man that I still am in touch with, John Bartlett. In fact, I owe him an email. John Bartlett over there started sending me tapes of potential hosts. And one of the tapes he sent me was of a guy named Andrew O'Connor hosting one of my shows. He was the second or third replacement host on Chain Letters. And I went, this guy's perfect. And on top of that, he's hosting one of my shows anyway. He must be smart. No. So then I went over, got to meet Andrew, and it was love in so many ways. And he did such a brilliant job on Talk About. As good as Wayne was, and Wayne was wonderful, Wayne had a certain, well, I'll say North American sensibility, because I think whether it's Canada or the U.S., that you could pretty much see the same kind of stuff. They were much more of having somebody who's much more comedically inclined do a show, long before the Steve Harvey or even some of the other stuff that happens on shows here. Andrew just did a brilliant job on the show, and subsequently we formed not just a friendship, but even a partnership on some projects. So that one I was real hands-on.
When you got back to things like Masters of the Maze, Majority Rules, did you end up getting a permanent role with Kline and Friends, or were you working freelance with them? Okay. No, freelance.
Okay. And Richard, though, Richard was very generous to me, which is not to say that I didn't deliver quality, because I always did. But Richard called me one day and said, what are you doing? And I said, right now I'm on the treadmill. He said, no, what are you doing work-wise? And this is when he had been doing Pictionary. And I don't know the circumstances, but Nancy, who was the producer, was no longer going to be the producer, and he offered me the job. And he was living in Connecticut by then, and he couldn't be hands-on. So I was running the show on a day-by-day basis, certainly checking in with him every day. But, I had to make sure the lights were turned on and off, and the water was running. And if he and Alan Thicke ever got into the room at the same time, I was referee, umpire, and distraught child between feuding parents, and in Masters of the Maze, I think he hired me because as the mirror man, he needed somebody who could judge the kid's answer in the moment, because they had some rather tenuous questions that they had me ask the kids as the mirror man. And the questions actually, I think, nobody ever said this, but I think they were written by Richard's own children. It was like, name a national monument or something.
When you were the mirror man, just quick, were you in the mirror man, I assume, or were you in the control booth?
Oh, no. I literally had a thing that was like a shower door or something. I don't know what it was, covered in aluminum foil. And I'd have to find a place and hide each time. And I could see either on a monitor or somehow knew as the kid was approaching, and it would just pop up. And there was one kid they told me they did have to take him backstage and hose out the suit he was in. I shouldn't laugh, but I apparently popped up a little too quickly. And I also tell the story because they would literally have a thing like, I'd say to the kid, name a flavor of gum. It's ludicrous questions. How do you judge it, right? Mm-hmm. So, and Richard just said, go with the flow. You're just to slow them down, but nothing is etched in concrete. So one day, I told the story and I made it up. It's that the kid's running and I jumped up and I said, "Name National Monument." And the kid said, "Damn!" And I said, "Which one?" Which was not entirely true, but it was because like once in a while a kid let out an expletive because they did say scare the kid, you know. You're the mirror man. You're frightening, you know.
Quick glance on majority rules.
Oh my God, that alone could be another 2.5 hours. First of all, though, let me say this: I won't say Steven Spielberg is the most impressive person I've ever met ever, and that's because subsequent to all the stuff I've done in game shows, I've been spending 20 years going to hospitals and doing magic, bedside magic for kids who are challenged in ways that don't have to be described, but you can just imagine. I've been at camps for those same 20 years as a volunteer, getting the best hugs I ever got from a kid who only had one arm, you know, whatever it may be. And those are the most impressive individuals I've ever met. Why do I say that to you? Because if you said to me, among all the people you ever met in the industry, who was the most impressive? Hands down, Steven Spielberg. Because Steven Spielberg was not only professionally impressive in terms of his profound art and talent and skill, he was who didn't forget how to be a human being. And when I was with Steven Spielberg, whenever I was with Steven Spielberg in his presence, I always pay attention, and he would respond and react in the same way you'd think Sadie from the Bronx or Jose from Oklahoma would react. And that's why he's successful, because his instincts and his interests are that of a broad swath of people in this country, and a caring, intense individual. The part was wonderful. But it was lunacy, because if ever I got involved in the morass of network overthink, it was on Majority Rules. We did, I think, 19 weeks of original episodes. I believe it was 19 or 20. I may be incorrect on that number. We probably had 15 distinct formats. You know, the basic theme was there, but we delayed production for 2 hours because they changed the red carpet to blue and the blue carpet to red. There were different seating areas. And I will be the first to say that I allowed myself to get more upset than I needed to at what was going on in terms of the manipulation. When I say manipulation, I don't mean that we rigged the show. I mean in terms of the overthink and the overkill and the how do we keep changing this thing so it is what everybody's happy with. Jeffrey Katzenberg is successful because he's successful. And like many other people I've worked with, and I've worked with some others, who have a history of having done something that works, and then their belief in their own opinion is reinforced, and then it's very difficult to work around that. But he, I think, has that in a particular dose. He came from Disney, and there was a whole aura. And other people, if you ask them, I'm sure will tell you that Disney will often say, "But we're Disney." Now, maybe they don't say that anymore, but that was something that was said many times to many people in many ways. And Jeffrey had just come off of Disney, as you remember. And now that, and a lot of the people, by the way, who were at DreamWorks were people who had been brought over from Disney by Jeffrey. So there was that to overcome, and people said, "But we're DreamWorks." And I was told that Majority Rules, actually, after we did X number of weeks, they went out and they were going to sell the show in syndication. And when station managers offered them less than the perfect time slot, they went, "No, it's got to be Prime Access or whatever it might be, because after all, we're DreamWorks." Well, it's just another show, my friend. You got to prove yourself first. So sometimes success can, engender possible failure. It's one that I think was ahead of its time for other reasons as well. I think it might have played better now than it played then. I loved what Mark did. I thought Mark was great. And by the way, here's the thing. Mark and Arthel were empowered to go out in that audience, stick a mic in anybody's face who had their hand up, and ask their opinion. We went into focus groups, and I heard people say, "Well, I've been around long enough. I know the producers telling them where to go. I know the producer's doing this. I know the producer's doing that. And as you well know, perception sometimes beats reality. And it doesn't matter what the reality was. If that was the perception, that was the perception. So it was a little bit of a heartache idea that I had had for years. And I'm still to this day grateful that I got to have a year at DreamWorks, that I got to work for Steven Spielberg. I can say for a fact, the first game show that was ever pitched to him, and I believe it was the only game show that was ever produced by DreamWorks, to my knowledge. And I had to pitch it directly. Do you have time for a Steven Spielberg pitch?
Absolutely.
Story? The backstory is a guy named Dick Block called me. He said, there's some people looking for somebody just like you. Would you like to meet with them? And it was on a Friday. And I had just come home from a meeting with, of all people, Stu Billett. You know, Stu Billett of People's Court, right? Mm-hmm. Stu had offered me a job that day, but it was late in the day. And Monday, my agent, Richard Lawrence, was going to call Stu and they were going to work out a deal. And I got home and there was a call from Dick Block. And he said, people want to meet with you. I told him what you do. And can you meet with them? And I said, look, I don't want to be a big shot, but I just kind of not taken a deal, but said to Stu Billett. So he said, you want to meet with these people? I said, well, why would I want to meet? What could this be? He calls me back in 5 minutes. He said, I didn't know if I could mention it. It's DreamWorks. This is when DreamWorks was 18 months old, right? And everybody in the world was going to DreamWorks. So we made it that on a Sunday we would meet for brunch. And I met with not the three big guys at the top, but the three guys who were in the TV department. And the brunch lasted so long that we literally got kicked out of the deli in Santa Monica. They went, we need the table. And I was able to say to these guys, look, guys, this is not a handle, but I owe it to somebody. And I had already called Stu Billett and said, Stu, give me the weekend to think about this because something is happening and I can't tell you what it is, but you'll understand why if it comes to fruition, why I'm asking you to wait. So on Sunday, I was able to say to the DreamWorks guys, if you don't want me, I understand. My heart will be broken. But if you do want me, I owe it to somebody else who's expecting me to make a deal with him. So I really do need to know. And what I had done on the day was pitch to them majority rules. I said, look, I may take a great meeting. You may think I'm a wonderful guy. But until you know what kind of ideas I have, you can't make any judgment about me. So I'm going to tell you an idea I've had for a long time. And I pitched the majority rules, knowing that I had pitched at other places, and plus I had trust in these guys anyway. So the PS of the story is, to move it along, they liked the idea, they liked me, we made a deal sooner rather than later. Stu Billett understood because it was DreamWorks, and I went to work for these guys 13 weeks. And they said, during this time, we want to hear that idea and any other ideas you have, and then we'll decide what you're going to pitch to Jeffrey. And I pitch a whole bunch of stuff, and they love majority rules, and now they rehearse me, chapter and verse. I came up with what I was going to say, but they went, no, take that out, put this in, leave that alone, emphasize this, because they wanted the pitch to be perfect for Jeffrey. And I don't know, 8 weeks in, I meet Jeffrey for the first time, and I pitch to him. And I know it's going okay, because he interrupts the pitch and says, well, could you do this at that point instead of that? I went, yes, in fact, you could do yo instead of low. Whatever, I'm going to go with the buyer. So I knew he was in, and they came back and said, we're moving ahead. Your contract is now picked up for at least another 13 or whatever it was. And let's start working on this thing. And we're going to eventually go to pilot with this. There was an element in the show. It was built to go as a wraparound the national lottery before there was a thing called Powerball and Super Bowl and whatever these other balls are. And they wanted to form a partnership with the Association of State Lottery Conglomerates. In order to do that, they wanted them to come to a luncheon at DreamWorks and hear a pitch of the show. And their lure to get those people to come was to tell them that Steven Spielberg would be at the luncheon. Not a bad, I'd go to that lunch, right? Here was the problem. Steven said, I'm not going to be the front man for a property that I don't know anything about. I have to see the property first. You got to pitch it to me. So now I'm faced with, I have to pitch to Steven Spielberg my cockamamie little game show idea. And I've pitched in other countries where English wasn't even the first language. I've pitched to some big shots and this, and that, but now it's Steven Spielberg. And once again, my bosses prep me and prime me and reassure me how well I've explained this to other people, and we have some visual aids and some props. And the way I would always pitch Majority Rules was, I didn't say, here's the show, this is what happens. At certain points, I'm doing role playing where I'd be the host, and then I'd be the contestant. What do you think you'd give up? Well, I wouldn't give up my wife because, and all of this stuff. So with my cards, with my boards, I schlepped down to his Amblin offices on the Universal lot. We're all standing around, everybody's affable, and then they say, he's here. And now I can feel that my sphincters tighten up. Every orifice I have is going open, close, open, close, open, close. And shake hands. He sits on the couch with some other people, and I go into the pitch that I've gone into with everybody else on the planet. And he's being attentive and polite, but I know what I have to do, and I don't even remember if I told anybody what I was going to do. But I said at a certain point, and then, because we've winnowed it down from the 100 people to the 50 to the 3 on stage, now we have our champion, and we're going to play the bonus round, and the way to make this work is with a real contestant. So, and I reached across the little table that was in front of the couch. I reached across, put out my hand, and I said, so Steven Spielberg, congratulations, you're the champ, you're playing the game. I then proceeded to have Steven Spielberg play the bonus round of Majority Rules, which had to do with writing the check and figuring out the numbers and whatever it was. And then, having written the check, and this is something you may have never seen, there was the component where there was going to be a tie-in with a local fast food like a Burger King or McDonald's. And we say, anybody can play, because all you do right now is take out a dollar bill. Here are the numbers that was the check, 3, 4, 5, 1, whatever it was. We're going to scramble them up, and we would scramble them up in post so we had some security. And if you have those numbers on any dollar bill in that order, go to your Burger King, and you'll get a share of the jackpot. I thought it was a pretty good idea. I found out later that somebody had done something like that in 1952 or whatever. There's no new ideas, but it was new enough, okay? In any event, I said that, and Steven Spielberg reaches into his jeans pocket and pulls out his money clip and starts looking at his money. And I said, stop. And everybody looked, because this is nothing I'd ever rehearsed before. I went, stop. And they all looked at me. I said, I'm doing a pitch of my baby, my game show, and Steven Spielberg just took out a dollar to see if he won, which was, validation of the game, of course. And he looked at me and he said, I just want to see if it could happen. I said, Steven, thank you. That's the point. It could happen. And he loved it. And then I will now go out of pitch mode and just go back into my adoration mode. I can remember at certain times having to go to the Amblin compound on the Universal lot to do some kind of business with the game show. And one time I'm walking in the courtyard, and Steven's at the other end looking at pictures for Jurassic Park or something. So I'm thinking I'm going to tiptoe and he looks up and he goes, hey, Mark, come on over. How's the game show coming? That's the kind of guy he was. And I felt so much of that. And I had heard, because I was doing hospitals by then already, so it's a lot longer than 20 years I've been doing hospitals. I had heard that he was involved in something that was connected with the Starlight Foundation, only with Starbright. And I said on another occasion, hey, Steven, I know you're doing the Starbright thing, and I do games. And the whole thing is, you're using these video hookups for the kids. If I'd help with any kind of game development on that, I'd love to be able to do that, because I think what you're doing is wonderful. And he paused for a real long time. And I thought, oh, gosh, I've just stepped over the line, and I've put my nose in his business. But I waited there. And then he looked at me and he said, I'm just trying to think who's the right person you should talk to, because I think that's a great idea. I said, okay, well, thank you. And I went back to my office. And 2 hours later, a woman called I'd never heard of before in my life. She introduced herself, and she said, Steven called me, and he thought maybe we could work together on this, the idea for Starbright. So that's the kind of guy he was, just real everyday salt of the earth kind of guy. Great experience. And you know what? What an experience. There were people, I called a guy, I mentioned his name, well, it doesn't matter who it was. I called a guy to tell him my good news, and I called him from my office at DreamWorks. And he wasn't there, and I left my number. So he called me back, and he said, "This isn't your regular number. Why are you calling me from this number?" And I said, "One word, DreamWorks." And he said, "DreamWorks wanted your old phone number?" It was like people couldn't believe my good fortune. I might think maybe they just couldn't believe that somebody with my limited talents had gotten the job. But this was like the brass ring. This was the center of the bullseye. This was the sash and the tiara and the 24 roses. DreamWorks, Spielberg. But then what I found out, and it's a wonderful book called, I think it's called The Men Who Would Be Kings or something like that there were loads of things in that whole DreamWorks configuration that sort of precluded them being as successful as we all thought they might have been. And part of it had to do with thinking, we're DreamWorks. So it's going to work just because we're DreamWorks.
Quickly, in regards to these, I know that I really want to spend a little bit of time on Beat the Clock, but quickly for Greed, any quick thoughts on that show?
That was one where I was offered the opportunity to work out of the office, and that was a mistake because the writers all worked together in a writer's room. They knew the material they were working on. I was separate and apart and would just go in every once in a while, and there was duplication of effort, and there was different style and different rhythm. So I don't mean like my feelings were hurt, but I never felt as if I meshed with the group there. So I don't have a lot to say about it. I'm just surprised that it didn't last longer because it certainly had a lot of the elements.
You and me both. Supermarket Sweep.
Al Howard is another guy that knows what Al Howard wants and knows that Al Howard's reality is the most important. It's ironic that I only worked 1 year on that show, but if people say, "What did you work on?" and if I do the long list, the show that gets some of the most positive reaction is Supermarket Sweep. It is fantasy fulfilled for people that they can run up and down a supermarket aisle and get all the food or merchandise that they want. Is for them wish fulfillment to the nth degree. And Al was a one-man show on his own. He knew what he wanted, and obviously he'd been successful, and it's coming back, as you know. David Ruprecht was a joy. And David Ruprecht, I think, didn't, at least I worked there only 1 year, and the show had been on many years before, and this is what I got from David. I think he felt that I treated him well, and I would make notes on things that could help him do his job better, and he always expressed great appreciation for that.
And then you did Beat the Clock. What is it like updating the classic Beat the Clock in 2002?
I had only one complaint about Beat the Clock. I was 3,000 miles away from the people I loved, and by that point I was doing camps, and I wanted to do camp more. On that end of it, it was the challenge. The fun was coming up with all those wonderful ideas. Gary Kroger was a joy to work with. Julie Lynn, who was the second banana, was marvelous. Some of the people at PAX, they were thrilled at first because they saw this wonderful production that we were getting. And then, again, they suddenly, a lot of them, but this is a constant complaint. So I'm not saying anything bad. I'm not going, PAX are terrible people. I'm going, everybody who's ever worked for a show that somebody else paid for, they're going to complain about the notes they get or this thing or the other thing. We had fun. It was a very loose atmosphere on the stage. We had fun testing the stuff. It was great going out. They literally would get those people that day to go out in the crowds and get people on the day. We sometimes, we luckily get people 2 or 3 days earlier. But the fact of the matter is, most of the people we got were tourists, so you couldn't pre-book them too far in advance because they were only there for a few days. So Gary was wonderful. The ability to just have a wall of ideas, and every time. A lot of time just walking around supermarkets or thrift stores, and I see an inflatable dolphin that you're supposed to take out in a pool, and he gave me an idea for six acts, and I thought, well, this is fun, So it was almost back in my Truth or Consequences days, but it wasn't like we were doing the gag kind of things. It was just, how could you do something physically that could be a lot of fun? So for me, it was fun, and Smokey Knutson, who was the line producer, and Angie Bartenbach, who was, I forget what title she had, but she was the make things happen person. She would put all those stunts together. Smokey was doing the crews and all of the usual line producer stuff, but Angie was make the bits happen. And we had a brilliant shop where they were building some of these props that were just marvelous. So all of that, it was truly it being in a playground. getting to, be some 50-year-old man and getting to play games. And the disappointment was we all left. The ratings were wonderful. And that was when I'd go to camp. And I never talked about my TV career when I was working at camp as a volunteer counselor. But the families saw the what do we call him, the stuntmeister, because I was demonstrating the stunts. And so they recognized me. So some of the families told me that they recognized me. Therefore, they knew I was the one on the show, and they loved it because it was so family friendly. It was a real good, we could all sit here and watch this. It was almost like a cartoon, all right? So the ratings apparently were very good, at least for PAX. So we all left thinking, we're coming back. We're going to come back for year 2. And this is one of those where the show got renewed and the network got canceled because, Bud Jackson decided I'm selling these stations and I'm getting out while I can. So we were gone, and now I get to watch reruns of Law and Order,
Taboo?
Taboo was one where it was great that you had a show based on a game that was a lot of fun. But again, this is when they were calling it TNN, and I forget, TNN. First it was the National Network, and then they bought it. Then it was the National Network, and I think they changed it to Spike after we left, but I can't remember. I think that was the case. But the notes we got from those people were just ridiculous. And they took what was a basically good idea, and they gimmicked it up so bad that I think all the gimmicks got in the way of the game. And if you did a taboo and you paid a penalty, it had to be something really garish and gross. That's not right. People who are inveterate game show watchers, they're watching to play along. Mm-hmm. They're watching to see what word would I say to get you to say bald if I couldn't say hair and fin and head and scalp. It's not, am I going to get slimed with old tuna fish? That's my belief on that.
I agree with you. But
again, I had a good relationship with the guys. Brian Hirsch, whose game it was initially, hired me to do many things after that. I worked for Brian on many non-TV things. And Peter Isaacson, whom I had known long before. In fact, I guess it was who brought me in. Because the story on that one was they literally went to the network and pitched them on the idea of the game. Now, there was a game in that there's a game inside the box of Taboo, but there was no TV format. And they got a pilot order based upon the box, and that's when Peter Isaacson called and said, now we need to come up with a format. And I'm one of the guys who will give you 20 ideas. Now, 19 of them may be crap. But the notion is, I'll keep going. How about, what if, how about, what if? And so I'm smart enough not to say at the end of the day, I didn't sell 19. I'm smart enough to say I sold 1. So it's not ego there. It's just that I'm like that pit bull who doesn't give up. But I just thought some of that stuff with the exploding this and the erupting that, that's not what the show should have been.
In that same vein, Let's Make a Deal 2003.
Well, they did exactly that same awful thing. They took a family-friendly game and they went hallelujah. And the classic example of that is, I'm not saying like this, but the classic example was, and you could imagine saying to a contestant, well, we want you to put your hand in 3 different boxes, and depending on what you feel, you decide, but that piece of paper could be a check for $5,000, or it could be a $1 bill, or it could say Zonk on it, right? But you're putting your hand in a box. Instead, they had a woman put her hand underneath a kilt, a hula skirt, and a toga, each of which was worn by a live male model. And that's NBC, 8 o'clock at night. Only because at the time they were doing, what was it called, Dog Pound?
Dog Eat Dog.
Dog Eat Dog, okay, thank you. Yeah, they would say go to the Dog Pound, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's not what Monty envisioned for Let's Make a Deal, which leads me to, oh, by the way, I will tell you this, and it doesn't matter who they were. I'm not going to name names. Again, Jeff Merkin, to his credit, got the job as one of the co-executive producers on the show. And he said, I've got the guy who can come up with the ideas that you need to make this work. And he had me go down for an interview. Now, do me a favor. I don't remember. What year was that NBC did Let's Make a Deal with Billy Bush?
2003.
So 2003 was 17 years ago?
Yes.
I was in my mid-50s. And the word came back, and it doesn't matter who said it, and I won't say that I did not hear these words, but I was told, in fact, maybe it was, they said, how old is the guy? And they said, don't bring him in. He's too old. And to his credit, Jeff Merkin said, you'll meet the guy and you'll change your mind. And I went down, and I blew them away, and they hired me to be the head writer, whatever. My big job on Let's Make a Deal, 2003, was to be the guy who would go alone in the room with Monty and try to convince him that it was okay to have a woman stick her hand up the skirt of 3 different guys. In other words, I was the Monty whisperer, because Monty, understandably, had a franchise he wanted to protect. And he had a sensibility. And there were many times, and this is the thing I feel proudest of. I don't feel proudest of, I would pitch ideas, and many of them were good, and they bought a lot of them. In fact, the piece of business that they used to have Billy Bush audition to prove it to everybody that he could host the show was a bit I came up with, and it had to do with an envelope and a $20 bill and a $200 and a $2, and I can't even remember what it was, but it was so simple and so pure, and they loved it. Okay, but that's not what I did. That was the hard job. The hard job was all of the writers would go in, we'd pitch to the executive producers, and maybe even the network people, I can't remember. And then I'd have this sheaf of papers, and Monty would show up, and I'd have to go into a room, and I would pitch to Monty. And I'd have to either convince him that what we were going to do was good, or get him on board with the idea enough that he would change it to where he felt comfortable with it, but not change it so much that the other guys didn't like it anymore. And Monty knew what that show was, and Monty always knew what that show was. And now I'm going to go far afield for a second. The reason why Let's Make a Deal now works with Wayne Brady is because it's not the same show. It's because the people who were doing it, Fremantle and CBS, are smart enough to have fashioned the show around Wayne's specific and very good talents. But it's a different show than it once was. There's a lot of the elements that are the same, but they built it around. But you go back in the history of the show, you pick anybody else who's hosted that show, that version never lasted. It lasted with Monty because Monty knew what he was doing. And of the however many episodes we did, the best episode we ever did was when they found a woman who had lost a car. She had 3 chances to win a car, and she blew all 3 times. And they found her somewhere in the San Fernando Valley, and they brought her back on the show, and then they brought me. And Monty did with her, and she won a car. And I remember this precisely, and I'll give myself a look back, Pat. Well, number one, he was brilliant. And even then, 20 years ago, he was 80 or whatever, or close to it. On top of that, they had something they wanted him to do, and he, in the studio, went, nah, that's not it. And we sat on the stairs, going up into the gallery, and fashioned and cobbled together. And I will say it was a partnership at that moment, and I felt so honored that Monty Hall by then trusted me and was listening to what I had to say. And he did the good job. Poor Billy, it's not Billy's fault. He had an IFB, he had an earpiece in each ear. And I was supposed to guide him through the act. And what I didn't know until episode 3 or whatever it was, he had an earpiece in the other ear, and people in the booth were telling him something different and I couldn't understand why he wasn't doing what I was telling him to do. That one was another one where I think people just over Pachki-Nuno that show.
I know you're a camp counselor, and I know we're getting away from the television, but you're a camp counselor, and I know you're extremely proud of that, and I know that you've done a lot of great work as a magician, as an entertainer for young people in very serious situations. Talk about that. Talk about how you got into that, and talk about why you continue to do that.
First of all, having said to you that I really feel proud of what I do, I feel honored to be allowed to do what I do, number one. And number two, I'm a very small cog in an amazing machine, a number of amazing machines. And if I did the things with kids, if I went up to a kid on a bus bench and said and did the things that I do when I'm a camp, I'd be wearing orange and eating cheese sandwiches at the county's expense. Camp creates the context where individuals who have hearts that are filled with love for children, it creates the context where we can all get together and form a symphony. And each one of us plays an instrument. But all together, we create this symphony of support for these kids. And kids who oftentimes down in the city, it's at school or on the street or in a store, kids who often are saying or thinking, don't look at me, or why are you looking at me? When they get to camp or going, look at me, look what I can do. So the game show history was one of the wonderful elements because if you're doing a game show correctly, it's not about the host. It's about the people who show up just one day and putting the light on them. And at camp, we're putting the light on kids who are allowed to think in terms of yes for once instead of no. And my sense of humor and my sensitivities, my sensibilities are maybe frozen at 9 or 10. I hope that I have the maturity of an adult to know when and how to be present with a child and to allow that child to feel loved and respected and honored and acknowledged. And what we can do if we go to a place like the Painted Turtle or Camp Ronald McDonald for Good Times or Camp Arroyo in Livermore, wherever it may be, and there are scores of these camps across the country, thankfully, and even across the world. Or, for that matter, the child life people in hospitals. You know, people right now are talking about nurses in hospitals and doctors in hospitals, and they're even remembering to talk about the custodial people who keep the places going. There's a group of people, no, I haven't heard anybody talk about, and they're the child life specialists, the people who really are taking the holistic approach, the people who prep a kid psychologically and intellectually for the procedure they're about to have, who'll tell the kid, now when you wake up, I'm going to let you know it is going to hurt, and I'm telling you now it's going to hurt, so that when you wake up and it hurts, you're not scared. It is true, it's going to hurt, but then it's going to stop hurting too. Or who worries, the child life people who worry about the siblings of children who are ill chronically or acutely or challenged. Those siblings pay a huge price. So guys and gals such as I who want to be a part of that process and want to just be a resource are allowed to do something that we don't get to do quite often in our lives, and that's to be of service to somebody else. That, I'm sure you know it from that you do in your life. I don't think that there's any other greater reward than if you can make a positive difference in the life of someone else. And if it's a child, even if it's the last day that child's going to breathe air, if you can do that, I think that's a really great gift that's been given to you. And every child I have ever met in a hospital or at a camp for kids with a profound diagnosis, every child that I have met defines herself or himself first as a child, and then after that as a patient or somebody who's challenged. But the desire to be a child is paramount, and that's why I'm so drawn to these camps. Today, before you and I spoke, I had two different meetings. One was Zoom, and one I did a video which I texted. The Zoom is about a group that goes in and does medical clowning in hospitals, and because currently we're facing this challenge where only the very essential people are being allowed in the hospitals, they're now going to do it through Zoom. The kid sitting in bed can have a laptop and have a conversation with somebody who's blowing bubbles or doing magic tricks or whatever it may be. And not only does that child prosper because of that, but the mom or dad who's sitting 5 feet away, who knows the diagnosis, that parent has a smile on her face or his face, knowing my child is loved by somebody who doesn't even know us. So do game shows still bring me rewards? Absolutely. Are they important? Yes, not as important as they once were. And what has working with the kids done? It's put the game shows in perspective. And if tomorrow you said to me I have a chance to sell another game show, I'd go for it. I wouldn't go for it if it meant I could never be in a hospital again or go to camp again. But I would do both. And in fact, I have done both. But in the old days, and I said this long ago when we were talking, just the smell of the studio alone was something that was exciting to me. And I knew I had kind of crossed over, and it was doing something for someone where he called and said, I know what you're doing with kids at camps and stuff, so we just need you to come in and give us some ideas and whatever, and you just come to the office, and you don't have to be part of the production in the studio. And I said, okay, that sounds like a good deal, and we worked something out, and I did it. And then I got a phone call a month later, and he said, I know what I told you, but it would be politically probably astute if you came to the studio one time just to see how things are going. So can we set that up? I said, absolutely. And we set up a date. And I went into the studio. And I'm watching things, and they're doing my ideas. They're doing things I came up with. I looked down at my watch, and I said in my head, if they can wrap this thing in a half an hour, I can get back to camp in time for campfire. And I knew that was the day when I was acknowledging where my priorities were. And by the way, that's not talking about my own family, which certainly, I hope, has always been the first priority. Sometimes I got distracted, and was writing questions while we were at the beach in Santa Barbara. But my wife would never go, after a while, she wouldn't go on a 1-week vacation because she'd say the first 2 days you're unwinding and the last 2 you're getting ready to go back. So we only have 3 days. It's got to be 2 weeks or nothing. And by the way, bless Al Howard. Here's something nice to say. I don't mean only nice, but here's something about Al Howard. I was already volunteering at Camp Ronald McDonald for good times when we were doing supermarket sweep. And with Al's permission and support, we got 3 teams, and all 3 teams, all 6 of the players, were people who were staff or volunteers at camp. And ultimately, whoever won the bonus round, they were playing for money for camp. And it really was good because Al was a little nervous that maybe because it was camp, I'd help the people out. And luckily, they didn't go all the way in the bonus. They only got the first 2 clues. And then, to his credit, Al doubled the money that they won in the bonus run. So he put that together. I put it together, but it was with his support, then doubled the money the camp would have won. So that's where camp and I got to tell you somebody else. Where camp and game shows came together, Harry Friedman, soon to be retired executive producer on Wheel and Joker. I got in touch with Harry. He not only made a contribution of unbelievable props and merchandise to Camp Ronald McDonald for good times, but he sent up members of the Clue crew to interact with the kids and conduct Jeopardy at the camp. So I think the game show community, whenever I've reached out and said, can you help me? There was a time when I was doing game show-orama with the kids. The kids at camp created their own game shows and had other kids play their games that they created. And I put out an email, and Phil Gurn and other people. Oh, and Tim Regler, who he wasn't, at that point he was doing Judge Judy and Judge Joe Brown. But they sent me stuff, pops and tchotchkes, rather for camp from shows. So that's where that stuff kind of all came together. It's just about letting people shine. A game show is about taking someone who otherwise might never be seen by tens or hundreds of people and let that person be seen by millions and let that person shine. And a good camp situation lets a kid, any kind of camp, but certainly kids who have challenges, lets them be in the light, lets them do what they can to the best of their abilities. So at the end of the day, you're talking about a guy who got paid money to play games. One day in elementary school, the teacher said whatever she said, and I said some kind of wisecrack remark. And it was probably the 27th wisecrack remark I had made just that one day. And this teacher looked down at me and said, it's that kind of behavior that's going to prevent you from ever getting a job. And if you get a job, you'll never keep it. And I one day opened my eyes and realized I've spent decades proving that woman wrong. That my nonstop mouth, my desire to engage with others, to make them happy, has afforded me a luxury that a lot of people don't have. I hope I haven't said anything untoward about any one individual. There's some people in my back pocket, but I'm just wasting my own energy if I tell you about this one or the other one. They are people who listened to my ideas, who paid money to have the collision of 2 pieces of gray matter burst forth into a $100,000 set and a $4 million production. And that was all from the idea of some kid who was born in the Bronx and whose mother ran out of food money on Thursday, and the paycheck didn't come till Saturday. So I'm real rich. 2 daughters and a granddaughter and a wife who has put up with me for 48 years. And I get to know people like Ron Greenberg, who I only spoke to 2 weeks ago, who is, beyond a mention. Now I'm going to start mentioning names and I'll forget somebody, and then I'll feel bad that I didn't say this one or the other one. But there's such a long list of people who afforded me opportunities, gave me a chance to listen to my ideas. And ultimately, in game shows, if we didn't have contestants, we wouldn't have game shows. So all those people whose names I don't know anymore, whose faces are not playing me anymore, who gave me my career, such as it is. And talk about will come back. Talk about it's going to come back. You're going to see it. I can't about it. By the way, because of present circumstances, ain't nothing coming back or nothing happening. But I had 2 different entities that are interested in talk about, but everything's on hold right now in this world. And I realize that this is something that you want to archive or whatever, but as I speak to you, the possibility of talking about coming back is quite, say, viable.
I hope it does.
I hope so too. And you know why? I have an ego, and I'd love for people to go, "Oh, that show's not bad."
I don't know if you need me stroking your ego, but I think you're great. And I think every show that you ever produced is great. And I think it was great because you took part in it.
You're very kind, but I probably, I learned a lot of lessons. I wish now, that I knew long ago what I know now, but I am forever grateful, and you're kind to say that. And here's the thing, guys like aren't going to be around much anymore because it's a different kind of business. It seems like A, they only want to go with stuff that has worked before, and B, from what I hear, if somebody did have a great idea, the entity to whom they went would say, "That's great, we're going to offer you a job on our show," as in, if you want this to see the light of day, we own it. And I'm one of the few guys who was lucky enough to still hold on to a piece of what was mine. And even my Talk About deal, I'm grateful for the Taffners, because they could have said, "No, it's ours for always." Because there are shows of mine that I could never do again, unless somebody hired me to. It's a business, but it's a show, and it was a lot of fun, and I hope it still is fun for people. And if it allows people to forget some of their troubles, that's good. That's good.
Purely from the form of television, because I know you're very proud of your charity work. This is purely from the point of a television. What would you say is your proudest achievement in terms of that?
You know what? Part of me says I wish you would ask me 2 days ago, because then I could have parsed that 6 different ways. It's an impossible question for me to answer at this point. That's how I'm going to answer it. I think that it wasn't any one show or any one deal. It was the opportunity to meet with and venerate and enhance what I hope the lives of others, and at the same time reap all kinds of rewards. There's different answers for different reasons. I can always say I was the only guy, to my knowledge, who produced a game show for DreamWorks, right? I could say that. I could say that, I had a show that was on in X number of countries and is still talked by people as being a bit of a cult kind of classic, which I think one of them was, okay? But it's mostly about the people I got to meet. That's the thing I feel so good about. Whether it was Singapore, we didn't even talk about some of the foreign stuff I did, to meet people in Singapore or India or Australia or England or Ireland, and to realize what I should have known long before then. Ultimately, we're all the same. We spoke different languages, but we all spoke the language of game show. So it's that kind of stuff. And to see sometimes the life-changing effect that winning a whole bunch of money had for certain people, that was great stuff. And to allow people to feel like they were stars, if only for a day, that's the bigger accomplishment. A lot of people have ideas. A lot of people have sold ideas. I also say that luckily I survived for a long time. I was lucky enough to have 3 jobs, each of which lasted 6 years, and another that was 2 years. That's 20 solid years of employment in a business where some people, get 6 weeks. So I was always very grateful for that. I'm not even boastful. Grateful is the word. Grateful that I was able to do that. And to have ideas, and I counted. If you count various countries of the world, I had a baker's dozen. I had 13 shows. So it was Singapore or BET or Ireland or wherever it was, ideas that came out of my cockamamie little brain that somebody was willing to take a chance on. It's more than proud. It's grateful. And I really do mean it. It's grateful. And that's not, I hope it's not a false humility. It is a gratitude. I'm going to be able to say that about what it was that I did. I know guys who worked in this business, and it was mostly guys back then, but then guys and women trying to sell something and never once sold one show. Now, they had careers because they were the showrunners. I'm not going to mention names. It's not fair to them. But they got hired on this show or the show or the other show. They never sell a show of their own. I got to do that. So it's in more the question of the body, the accumulation, than any one show. In terms of favorites, I love, by the way, some of my favorite shows are shows that lasted hardly at all. On the one hand, I love Talk About. I love the energy of Talk About. I love the accessibility of Talk About. I love the entertainment of Talk About. But I've come up with some game ideas, including the one element in what they call Think Twice, where you were hiding the clues within a story that you told. People told me that couldn't be done. People told me that I could do that. And then I watched a co-ed from Harvard tell a story to the amazement of people in the room, so much so that they stopped to run through and call other people to watch how well it was done. And I thought, I've devised a new game, and someone's playing that game, and that makes me feel good. But in much the same way, and I'm going to go to the other stuff, there's elements at certain camps that they're using now for 10 or 5 years that I know I brought to that camp. And I don't get a penny for that. I get the satisfaction of knowing that the kids are laughing at that particular piece of business. And that accumulation in terms of career, so many people get stuck having to put on a polyester suit and have to sell things that they don't have faith in to people who can't afford them. And I didn't have to do that. I got to be silly. I got to laugh. And I got to see other people laugh as well and feel good about themselves. Wow. That's, to me, the achievement.